Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Delta Salinity Management Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Laurel Larsen, the Delta Lead Scientist, and on behalf of the Delta Science Program and the Workshop Planning Committee, I want to thank you all for your time. Acknowledging the deep history of stewardship of the Delta. It looks like my internet kicked me off momentarily. Can you all hear me today? Or can you all hear?
Yeah, Dr. Larsen, yeah, it seems like your internet's really unstable. We haven't been able to hear what you've been saying.
Edmund or Brandon?
Oh no. Hear us either.
I will call you.
Just 1 second, everyone, while we take care of technical difficulties.
Here.
Edmund, you're welcome to put the slide and music back on while we wait for Laurel.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So I'm sorry for those technical difficulties this morning. I will just go ahead and restart the intro, assuming that you weren't able to hear me before. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Delta Salinity Management Workshop Series. I am Laurel Larsen, the Delta Lead Scientist, and on behalf of the Delta Science Program and the Workshop Planning Committee, I want to thank you all for the gift of your time today. One of the themes that emerged yesterday is that it is important to consider the historical context for management of our estuary. And so, as with yesterday, I would invite us to start our day today by acknowledging the deep history of stewardship of the Delta. We acknowledge that the Delta and larger Bay Estuary is located within the ancestral territory of the native peoples of the numerous villages and tribes of the Bay Miwok, Coast Miwok, Plains Miwok, Maidu, Ohlone, Patwin, Pomo, Wapo, Wintun, and Yokuts, who make up tribal groups both recognized and unrecognized. We recognize that these people have continually occupied the Bay Delta area for thousands of years. Through a violent history of colonization and dispossession, we as guests benefit from living and working on the traditional homeland of these native people. We wish to show our respect to them, their ancestors, and their sovereignty by acknowledging the injustices inherent in this history and their current efforts to achieve restorative justice. We acknowledge the ancestors, elders, and relatives and affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We acknowledge that the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program, and other organizations represented here today are benefiting from the displacement and dispossession of Native people from their traditional homelands. Consistent with the values of community, inclusion, and diversity, it is vitally important that we recognize that the land on which we reside is unceded tribal territory and acknowledge and support the Native peoples who continue to form a crucial part of the Bay Delta community today. We also acknowledge that Native peoples remain dedicated to fulfilling their obligation to the Creator to care for Mother Earth and all living things and return sacredness to the land through the restoration of traditional knowledge and stewardship throughout the Bay Delta. There is much that we need to learn from the Bay Delta's tribal communities who have been stewarding our natural environment since time immemorial. Although this statement acknowledges the ancestral and unceded territories of the original Native peoples of the Bay Delta, we recognize that additional steps are required to move towards meaningful restorative justice. It is our hope that this workshop will contribute toward building beneficial and constructive relationships that support tribes in restoring their role as land stewards and elevating and integrating Native communities in the planning and decision-making for a healthy and resilient Bay Delta. So we have some topics that I'm personally very excited about queued up for today. But first, a few logistics. Just so you know, when you are on this Zoom call, you are automatically muted with your webcam off. And so if you have a question, type that question into the chat. If you have any technical issues, email engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov, or there is a phone number being displayed that you can call or text. If you don't hear anything, do try adjusting your audio settings. You could get to it by using the up caret next to the microphone and selecting audio settings, and sometimes you might need to select a new speaker. I also want to let you know that we're using the hashtag Salinity Management for this workshop, so please tweet, post Instagram posts about it, and spread the word via social media. Next slide, please. So as I said, we do have an exciting day queued up for today. Our morning is devoted to the scenario planning pilot exercise, which I will begin by presenting, and then we will have a pretty long period of time to discuss that exercise in breakout groups. After lunch, the breakout groups will report out to the larger group, and then we'll go into a panel discussion on how we might go about creating an adaptive management framework for managing salinity. And then finally, towards the end of the day, we will wrap up and discuss the next steps. Next slide. So I am going to kick us off today with an introduction to the scenario planning pilot exercise. And I'm presenting this on behalf of a modeling subcommittee that was convened to serve as a liaison between the larger group of workshop participants and the modelers who will eventually be realizing this planning pilot exercise. The modeling subcommittee was convened by myself, as well as Stephen Elser, a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Stewardship Council. And Stephen, I will invite you to say a few words about your background and introduce yourself to the group. And I'm going to take advantage of this moment to bring up my notes since I was having technical challenges this morning.
Yeah, sure. Happy to say a few words, Laurel. Thanks. So hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Elser, as Laurel said. I'm a senior environmental scientist within the Adaptive Management Unit within the Delta Science program. I recently completed my PhD from Arizona State University, where a lot of my research focused on issues of climate resilience in cities and working together with stakeholders and communities to help envision through scenario processes of how we can produce positive climate resilient futures via nature-based solutions, traditional engineering solutions, and a variety of other sort of strategies. So really excited to be here to learn about the Delta ecosystem, to learn from each of you, and to work together to create some positive visions for the Delta. So thank you, Laurel, and hopefully that gave you enough time to find your notes.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for co-convening this modeling subcommittee. So next slide, Edmund. I have a bit of an outline here on how I'm going to use the time this morning. I'm going to start out with an overview of this pilot exercise, focusing a little bit on the who, the what, the when, and the why, and then an overview of the modeling approach that we might take in this pilot exercise. It's going to be a little bit of Delta Salinity Modeling 101, and I think will help us really focus our conversations in a concrete manner during the breakout session that will follow this plenary. The modeling subcommittee has proposed a set of focal questions that we might seek to address. These are science questions that could be that are answerable with models that are currently available. So following the introduction of those focal questions, I'll get into a brief introduction to the modeling toolkit that is available to us, as well as some of the off-the-shelf hydrodynamic and salinity scenarios that our work could draw upon. And then I'll present to you some climate and management scenarios that the modeling subcommittee feels are feasible and valuable for further study. We'll talk a little bit about how we might go about evaluating impacts and trade-offs of these different salinity management and climate scenarios. And then I will queue up our breakout group exercise before discussing next steps and allowing time for questions and discussion. So next slide, please. So this is a slide that Karen Kafetz presented yesterday in providing an overview of this series of workshops. And in case you weren't here yesterday, or in case you need a reminder, I did want to bring this up again in order to frame how the pilot exercise fits within the larger scope of the workshop. So just as a reminder, the long-term goal of this workshop is to kick off a collaborative adaptive management process through which stakeholder groups and those that have a stake but haven't previously been at the table can come together and have systematic discussions about how we might creatively think about managing salinity as we face future challenges of drought and sea level rise. So we believe that that doing a demonstration exercise or a scaled down version of this approach can be beneficial in helping focus conversation and highlighting the gaps in our existing tools. So we're developing a pilot demonstration exercise that we will develop in coordination with working groups through 3 summer meetings. And by the October workshop, we will have run scenarios in this demonstration exercise, and we'll have those outputs available to discuss as a larger group. This will allow us to begin discussing in a very concrete manner the performance metrics that we could use to evaluate these different scenarios, discuss the trade-offs that are apparent in the different scenarios, and then refine ideas about future research and scenario-based modeling needs in order to make the collaborative adaptive management process proceed more smoothly. So next slide. So the question is, why do a pilot exercise? Next. So for one, a pilot exercise will allow us to learn by doing. And this is a classic strategy in adaptive management, to start with a small scale endeavor before launching a larger effort. The pilot exercise will help us highlight the points of agreement and disagreement in approaches to modeling salinity and its effects. And it will also help us to identify what are the key gaps or questions that we would ultimately like to answer, but don't have the resources to address currently. And by identifying these resources, these resource needs at an early stage, we can target investments of time and research dollars into filling those gaps. Next. So another purpose in doing a pilot exercise is to demonstrate the value of a collaborative, forward-looking approach to long-term salinity management. And then the question is, to whom do we demonstrate the value of this approach? Well, the idea behind this workshop series and the pilot exercise has been presented to the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, or DPIC. We really need DPIC member buy-in in order to ensure that agencies are able to commit resources and personnel to the larger scale, longer term collaborative adaptive management approach that we hope to launch. And so one outcome of this pilot or this demonstration exercise is that it is something that we could leverage to gain support by DPIC member agencies. And it's also something that we could leverage in seeking additional external funding in order to help us realize this goal of launching a longer-term collaborative adaptive management approach. These resources might be resources that come from the National Science Foundation or other major agencies, and could provide support for some of the cyber infrastructure needed to help combine models or make those models more available, more readily available, and more transparent. Next. So another reason to do a pilot exercise is that there's inherent value in addressing a smaller scale portion of the larger challenge of salinity management. We can address or begin to address particular management questions and produce some recommendations for future research. For example, one of the questions or themes that have come up in early conversations around the idea of this demonstration exercise is that we could use it as a way to begin to evaluate the long-term performance of nature-based solutions for managing salinity versus or in addition to traditional engineering solutions. We don't yet have a good idea of how these alternative approaches play out over longer timescales and under future climate conditions. And this is something that could also be beneficial to the Delta Stewardship Council's ongoing Delta Adapts initiative. In 2021, the Council came out with a Delta vulnerability assessment, and they are currently in the process of developing an adaptation report in which they will evaluate different adaptation scenarios and their associated trade-offs. And one of the questions that is of interest to that group is how nature-based solutions could be leveraged for multiple benefits, including benefits of salinity management. So there could be inherent value in addressing at least beginning to address questions of the performance of these alternate solutions. Next slide, please. So the modeling subcommittee that was convened for this workshop consisted of people, by and large, who are familiar with models used for salinity and hydrodynamics within the Delta, or are familiar with how the results of those models might influence management of other resources, including wildlife resources. So I want to acknowledge the work of the subcommittee, the ongoing work of the subcommittee, which represents a number of different agencies, and thank them for their time so far. So the modeling subcommittee has convened 3 times already, and I think it's useful to talk through our process and our goals. We've convened 3 times already with the goals of serving as a liaison between workshop participants and modelers who will be executing the plan that we collectively develop. Another goal is to help develop a demonstration exercise that is feasible to complete on a short time scale and valuable to the community of workshop participants. And we've done a lot of work on the front end to identify exercises that we believe would be feasible. I will give you a window into our rationale behind what we're going to propose. And we're really relying on you all, the community of workshop participants, to help us identify what is going to be valuable and how we might work within the constraints of available models to create something that is valuable for answering near-term questions, but also producing a demonstration of the value of the longer-term process. Another goal of our subcommittee was to synthesize information about the available toolkit for the pilot exercise and to help identify gaps. And those gaps are going to inform investments that are needed for the longer-term process. So I'm now going to shift into a discussion of the synthesis part of what the modeling subcommittee has done, and try to bring this group up to speed on the tools that are used, how they're used, how modelers think about approaching an evaluation of scenarios of salinity management. And that's going to help us focus discussion on what we can do in terms of linking those salinity model results to impacts that are of interest to our larger group. So next slide. And hopefully that video will start playing. So this is a slide that I presented yesterday, but I just wanted to remind us that there are many strategies on the table for salinity management. There are traditional engineering strategies, such as the use of barriers, like the barrier across the West False River, Sassoon Marsh salinity control gates, Delta Cross Channel, but there are also nature-based solutions, namely wetland restoration, that can have a large role on the redistribution of salinity through the Delta. And so the example that I showed yesterday is how this planned restoration design for the Franks Tract is actually quite effective at decreasing salinity penetration into the South and Central Delta. Flow actions are also tools in our toolkit. And then yesterday, we actually heard quite a lot about regulatory strategies for salinity management, as well as demand management, namely the reduction of demand. In our early conversations within the modeling subcommittee, most of our work focused on identifying a contrast between traditional engineering solutions and nature-based solutions, because the models that we have are well set up for looking at that contrast. But one of the things that was really interesting to me about the meeting yesterday is that a lot of our conversation then focused on these regulatory knobs and demand management knobs for salinity management. And so looking at those aspects of salinity management might be something that we reserve to address in the longer term collaborative adaptive management process, because there are just so many conversations that need to happen among diverse groups of people in order to meaningfully address possible regulatory changes or demand management in the modeling sphere. But I just wanted to acknowledge that tension that emerged between what the modeling subcommittee has focused on and what this group seems to be really interested in. Next slide, please. I'm going to motivate the rest of this talk by a general question. The general question that I think we're all interested in, and the reason why we're all here, is something that's not directly testable with models, but it's a useful starting point. And this general question is, which options for managing salinity are most sustainable? And we could talk about sustainability in terms of water supply, ecosystems, economies, people's values. But which options for managing salinity are most sustainable under future droughts and with sea level rise? And the reason why I say this isn't directly testable with models is there isn't a quantitative definition of sustainability. There are many aspects of sustainability that require us to examine trade-offs. And so one of the things that we've done as a subcommittee that I'll get to a little bit later is we've broken down this question into several different sub-questions that are directly testable from the models. But if you go to the next slide, I'll show you just a general flow diagram of how we think about this modeling process, which is a starting point for the development of a demonstration exercise. So a typical flow diagram for doing a model of salinity and its effects would be to take inflows from the Delta's watershed. So these would be reservoir inflows at the upstream end, and then evaluate tidal level at the downstream end, which is impacted by sea level rise, and use those boundary conditions in a hydrodynamics and salinity model. There are many flavors of these models. I will take you through a whirlwind tour of some of the most common models that are used to model hydrodynamics and salinity within the Delta, but there's a list that is shown on this diagram. And the output of those models would be the spatial distribution of salinity and also a number of different flow quantities. Those outputs could then inform models of habitat, local economics, agriculture, different biological models, population models, and so on. So next, please. If we're thinking about developing scenarios that we could contrast against each other, we would put different structural or hydrodynamic alternatives or manipulations into those hydrodynamics and salinity models. And the good news is that there are a lot of off-the-shelf versions of the listed models available that implement things such as the salinity barrier or habitat restoration. What we want to do is layer those management scenarios on top of different climate scenarios. And so climate really comes in into consideration with the inflows and the tidal level. Next, Edmund. So as I said before, sea level rise influences that lower boundary condition. And go ahead and click to the next one. Drought conditions or future climate change would really influence those inflows. But But it's not quite that simple. There's actually a lot of complexity when it comes to thinking about future inflows or what's reasonable to assume under future conditions. So go ahead and click to the next one, maybe the next two. So one example that we might have would be to look at the historical record and selectively take dry years, resample those and feed those into our model as a hypothetical drought of the future. Or we could use climate models to actually project what future conditions are likely to be in a particular decade, and then use an operations model in order to estimate what those new inflows to the delta would be. And I'm going to get into a little more detail here because this is really important in thinking about how we actually put climate change into these scenarios that we might consider. So go ahead and go to the next one, Edmund. So the first option that I talked about previously is to get delta inflows by selecting from and then resequencing the historical record. So I put together a schematic diagram here in which each of these circles represents a water year. You could read just from left to right and up to down here. So if we look to the past, there's a number of wetter and drier water years. If we wanted to create a drought scenario for the future, and you could go ahead and click again, Edmund. We might select from among these observations and just put them in a different order. So now what you're looking at would be four different possible representations of a hypothetical 5-year drought. And we could do this in several different ways to come up with a range of estimates of how these droughts might impact the delta. So we would have 4 different model realizations here, which give us some estimate of uncertainty. So go ahead and click again, Edmund. Now there's an assumption here, which is that the relationship between historical inflows and water operations is representative of future conditions, which might not necessarily be the case. And this certainly, go ahead and click again, Edmund, this certainly is not a good assumption for sea level rise scenarios. And so we need to likely get a little bit more complex in thinking about these future scenarios. And you could go to the next slide. So another option then would be to get the delta inflows by selecting from and resequencing historic reservoir inflows. So this is what's coming into the reservoir, and then applying an operations model. And the operations model that we're talking about and that I will discuss in a few more slides is CalSim. So now what you're looking at on the right here represents reservoir inflows for a hypothetical 5-year drought. And then you could go ahead and click, Edmund. And we would run that through the operations model. The latest one that is available is CalSim 3. And click again, that would provide us with delta inflows. So this is something that can account for sea level rise. It can also run these historic hydrologic scenarios through the modern infrastructure that we have in the delta and its watershed. And this would give us something that we could think of as a hypothetical drought, not pinned to a particular time or decade in the future. So this might be a good option for the pilot exercise. Next slide. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this operations model, CalSim. There are 3 versions. There's CalSim 1 through 3. 3 is the latest. It's an operations model that is based on modern infrastructure within the delta. And it takes as inputs reservoir inflows, local water supplies, water consumption among urban and agricultural users, water allocation contracts, and reservoir operations regulations. And then the outputs of this model include monthly reservoir releases, river flows, the stored water within the reservoirs, water delivery, delta exports, and indicators of delta water quality conditions, including salinity. So one note about sea level rise here is that there are versions of CalSim 2 that were designed to model operations with 1.7 feet and 2.8 feet of sea level rise. Currently under development as part of CalSim 3 is a version with 1 foot of sea level rise. So these are things that are off the shelf. So for any of the resequencing approaches that I just talked about, one drawback is that what precedes the sequence of interest in time, so the initial conditions for running this model, are not necessarily known and might not be representative of future conditions. So overcoming this potential drawback can be overcome by using climate projections. And so the next two methods that I'm going to present use climate projections to actually look at hypothetical conditions associated with particular decades or ranges of years in the future. So go ahead to the next slide, Edmund. And the basic approach here is to use a general circulation model. So these are just loosely referred to as climate models. There are many that are available, and using several different climate models enables us to come up with estimates of uncertainty around our model projections. One thing to know about these climate models is that the resolution on them, the global resolution, is fairly coarse, as represented by the pixels on the image that you see on the left. So in order to use these climate projections, we really need to downscale them to finer resolution. And there are models available, including the model shown by the Scripps Institute of Oceanography for downscaling those models for California. The next step then is to take that climate information and run it through a hydrologic model that produces river flows as an output. Those river flows are routed through another model. These are typically called the VIC, or the variable infiltration capacity models, or the river routing version of that, which is RVIC. But the output of these hydrologic models then would be the reservoir inflows. Those reservoir inflows would then be run through the operations model, CalSim, to get the monthly delta inflows. But a lot of the questions that we might want to address should be addressed by looking at timescales finer than 1 month. And so the next step would be to actually downscale that operations model output to the daily timescale. The USGS has one model known as CRUSPY for downscaling the CalSim outputs. And basically what they do is they look at the monthly projection that comes out of CalSim, and then they look at the historical record, and they find a month that closely matches the monthly totals that come out of CalSim, and then basically take the daily variation within that month as what is used to produce the daily delta inflows. So that's one particular approach for going from climate projections to delta inflows. But there are some critiques associated with this particular approach. And one critique is that the general circulation models run through this variable infiltration capacity, or hydrologic model, produces results that don't replicate the historical interannual variability observed in the hydrology of the Delta's watershed. And so that is one drawback. Another drawback here is that not all inflows to Delta reservoirs are currently represented in the VIC model. And so other research teams have taken another approach to get from climate projections to Delta inflows, which I'm summarizing in the next slide. So the first part of this approach is still the same. You would generate estimated river flows from the variable infiltration capacity model, but then you would use that output in a different way. So with this approach, which is an approach used by DWR, a monthly perturbation ratio is calculated in which the historic average, or in which the future average reservoir inflows that come out of this VIC model are compared to the historic modeled average reservoir inflows out of that model to look at how much of a perturbation there is from historic conditions to projected future conditions. And this is done on a monthly basis. This is a bit of an oversimplification the way I'm describing it, but this is the basic idea here. And then on the next slide, that perturbation ratio, that monthly perturbation ratio is multiplied by observed historic reservoir inflows for that particular month to get projected reservoir inflows. So projected reservoir inflows are really taken from the historic record, perturbed in a way that is informed by these climate model outputs. One critique of this approach is that this approach might not represent the fact that atmospheric river dynamics are changing with climate change, and so that historical baseline that you're multiplying by a perturbation ratio might not actually be representative of future conditions. So as you can see, each of these approaches has particular drawbacks and assumptions. And in our modeling subcommittee, we got into a lot of interesting discussions about what these are. And I think it highlighted some areas for further discussion in a collaborative adaptive management approach. But Edmund, next slide. When these slides are posted, you'll see that I just came up with a summary of these different approaches for inflows, and those are they will be shown on the next slide. I don't think I'm going to dwell on that slide, but this is basically just summarizing those assumptions, caveats, and critiques that I just talked about. But go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to highlight that a big assumption in any of these off-the-shelf models, particularly models that use calcium, is that reservoir operations will prioritize meeting in-delta regulations. This is a really big and tenuous assumption because, as we all know, during drought conditions, temporary urgency change petitions are issued. There are constraints on how much cold water must be held behind the Shasta Dam in order to meet cold water requirements that are not currently in calcium. And so calcium doesn't actually represent how these operational decisions are made during drought conditions. Calcium also assumes that reservoirs can be operated to dead pool, which would likely not happen in reality. I wanted to bring this up because it's really important to acknowledge it's not an assumption that we will likely be able to relax in our pilot exercise, but this is a big need to keep in mind for our longer-term collaborative adaptive management process. So then I'm going to pivot to what do we think we can address in this pilot exercise. Next slide. I know you're not able to read this, but I just wanted to provide a snapshot of the process that we went through as a modeling subcommittee. We had a really great mural that we were working with to brainstorm questions that we could address in this demonstration exercise that would be valuable and feasible and relevant to a larger scale trade-off analysis. I will get into the details of those questions, but what we came up with is on the next slide. So some questions that we landed on that are specifically related to salinity and hydrodynamics are the ones that you see here. In a few more slides, I'll get into a discussion of how we might go about evaluating a wider suite of trade-offs and impacts. But some of the concrete questions that we came up with as a subcommittee were, first of all, assuming in-delta regulatory standards are met, which is an assumption in using calcium. For how long can the scenario conditions persist within water years until reservoirs can no longer generate power or until they are at dead pool? And just a note here, though it is unrealistic that the reservoirs would be operated to dead pool, we think that this question could serve as a useful and objective benchmark for comparing scenarios because it is likely relevant to how long those conditions could persist until we would need to think about putting in a salinity barrier or instituting TUCPs. So another question is, how does salinity vary spatially, and what are the monthly and daily fluctuations in salinity with the actions that will be contrasted in the demonstration exercise? where is the low salinity zone located? And this is of critical importance for managed fish species within the Delta. Then how do residence times vary throughout the Delta with these scenarios? And what is the salinity of water available for in-Delta agricultural diversions? Next slide. So we felt that those questions were the lowest hanging fruit that we could consider with off-the-shelf models. But there's a few additional questions that we'd like to propose for consideration and further modification in our breakout groups today. And one might be, how might an additional barrier change the amount of time that the scenario conditions can persist until it's not possible to meet regulatory standards? This is a question that is newly answerable with the Delta Emergency Response Tool that the consulting firm RMA recently presented at the QUEMF meeting. But essentially, this tool uses machine learning to identify optimal locations for a barrier. Another question could be, could large-scale restoration delay the installation of a barrier as drought develops or make it unnecessary to install a barrier? And what is the sensitivity of salinity conditions to changes in project deliveries and in-delta diversions under different reservoir release amounts? Next slide. Because of the timescale on which we were operating, the modeling subcommittee really focused most of its early work on thinking about salinity and hydrodynamics and their distribution. And we are very interested in seeking feedback from this group on how we might be able to link those outputs to other questions of interest to a wide range of stakeholders. And these are not comprehensive, but just a few examples to get the breakout conversations seeded today would be things like, what are the economic costs and benefits associated with these scenarios with respect to several different types of variables? We might look at changes in agricultural revenues, and there's some precedent in using the Delta Agricultural Production or DAP model for this. Changes in water cost. Another question might be, what is the tidal excursion associated with each scenario, which has relevance to a lot of fish species? So what would be the related impacts on Chinook salmon? And this is a metric that is available through some of the existing hydrodynamic models and is already being coupled with a particle model that looks at salmon survival. That's work by Russ Perry, John Bureau, and John Stumpner. So next slide. I wanted to use some time today to give you a little bit more of an overview of the toolkit. So the models that are available and some of the off-the-shelf scenarios available through those models. So this is going to be just a bit of a whirlwind tour. I don't have time to get into details, but next slide. One of the models that DWR has worked extensively with is the Bay Delta Schism model. This model is a 2 to 3D model. There are different versions that are available. The basic case is the 3D model. And the computation speed for this model is about 2 days per year. So when it's run in 3D, it can be quite computationally intensive. Next slide. It is a free and open source model that's available at GitHub. It was developed through the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. It's widely used. There's a huge range of publications that employ the Schism model in many Bay Delta applications. One of the applications is being shown on the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of the False River salinity barrier performance as assessed through the Schism model. In this image, the barrier is in place, and the colors that you're looking at show the salinity difference from a scenario without the barrier versus a scenario with the barrier. And so blue colors here mean that when the barrier is in place, there are less saline conditions, and that's particularly pronounced in the Franks Tract area in the South and Central Delta, which is the intention of the barrier. Next. Schism has also been used to look at the Franks Tract futures scenario. And so again, what you're looking at is the difference with wetland restoration implemented within the Franks Tract versus not. And you can see that there is a large decline in salinity in the Franks Tract and South and Central Delta, though if you look at the numbers on the scale bar, you'll see that that decline isn't quite as much as when the salinity barrier is in place. And interestingly, on the next slide, you can see Schism has also been used to look at Franks Tract futures with additional restoration in Dutch Slough, Prospect Island, in the McCormick-Williamson floodplain. And one of the things that you see here, and just go ahead and click one more time, Edmund, is that if you look at Franks Tract futures alone, the salinity is actually lower than when these other restoration projects are added in, which just further argues for the importance of thinking about restoration at the landscape scale in terms of its impacts on salinity. Next slide. So another model that's used commonly is the RMA Bay Delta Model, also available in 2D and 3D. And this model has been used to look at various flooded island scenarios. And in fact, anyone can go on to this website that's shown in the lower right, get an account, and play around with this tool that allows you to look at impacts of different levee breaches. And these could be either intentional levee breaches to create wetland restoration areas or unintentional levee breaches. And so they also have some large-scale restoration scenarios that are available, including the public lands scenario, Eco Restore, and then 3 large areas in the North Delta. And what you're looking at here is, oh gosh, I can't quite see it. Okay, oh yeah, so this is the fractional change in electrical conductivity that you're looking at. So this is related to salinity, and you'll see that in the area in the vicinity of the Franks Tract, only the 3 North restoration scenario actually results in lower salinity in the South and Central Delta. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go really quickly through the next few slides so I could get to our proposed management scenarios. But Edmund, if you could just click through. Another model that's commonly available, commonly used by consulting companies such as Delta Modeling Associates, as well as RMA, is the UNTRIM Bay Delta Model. This is available in 3D. There's also a 2D version that's trained on the 3D, for which computational speeds are much faster. Next slide. The USGS has the Cascade model, which is built on the Delft 3D modeling system. One really nice thing about this model is that it has been linked to a lot of other models for sediment, fish, phytoplankton, bivalves, contaminants, marshes. In Knowles et al. 2018, there are future climate change projections available to 2099 with 10 different global climate models and 2 emissions scenarios. So those are off the shelf, and I know that they do have a publication that's pending in which they're looking at different manipulations, such as the salinity barrier, on top of those climate scenarios. Unfortunately, the timing of that won't align with our pilot demonstration exercise, but that model might be available to us in our longer-term collaborative adaptive management planning process. So next slide. So given this survey of the models and what's available off the shelf, the modeling subcommittee wants to propose for further consideration a set of management scenarios that we could layer on top or cross with the different climate scenarios that I'll talk about in the next slide. So we're proposing looking at the Franks Tract futures restoration, which is available through Schism, implementation of the False River salinity barrier in accordance with the permit pending to the Department of Water Resources. This is available through Schism. And then also to look at a large-scale restoration scenario. And we're very interested in hearing from this group which particular restoration scenarios might be of most interest to the group. I think there's an advantage here in using multiple models. Multiple models can give us some range of uncertainty, but it will be really important to run baseline computations with each of these models so that we know how model outputs compare to each other. And then next slide. So the climate scenario, oh, I'm sorry, you could go back to the last one. The climate scenarios that we would propose layering on top would be 1-year drought, 2-year drought, 5-year drought. And again, we're interested in hearing from the larger group which of these might be of greatest interest. And then 2 different levels of sea level rise imposed on top of drought. We can't go above 3 feet of sea level rise because in these models, the levees would then be overtopped. And those models assume that the levees are essentially static entities. Now, the 1-foot and 3-foot recommendations come out of sea level rise projections from the Bay Delta on the next slide, summarized in the Delta Adapts Vulnerability Assessment. And so, you know, 1 foot of sea level rise is quite likely for the mid-century, whereas 3 feet of sea level rise is quite likely towards the end of the century. Next. And you could just skip ahead too. I just wanted to give a little bit of attention to some of the off-the-shelf models that might be available in looking at impacts of salinity and hydrodynamics. So one that is available, and you can go to the next one, is the Delta Smelt Summer Fall Habitat Availability Tool. This is a tool that is also available through the RMA model. And again, this is something that the public can go to their website and click through. And this model uses the RMA Bay Delta model for the 2D realizations and the RMA untrim model for the 3D realization. This is basically comparing several different types of salinity action, salinity management actions on the habitat suitability for Delta smelt in terms of the salinity suitability and overall habitat suitability. And one of the things that you can see is that in the North Delta, the Sassoon Marsh salinity control gates really make a big difference here. So I'm not going to get into the details other than to say that this is available. And then next slide. Josue Medellin Azuara, who I believe is participating in the panel later today, has a nice paper in SFUS in which he links outputs of a number of different salinity management models and different scenarios, including conveyance, sea level rise scenarios, and inundation of 5 Western Delta islands. Those outputs are linked into the Delta agricultural production model in order to estimate future changes in cropping patterns and crop revenues. And so a similar linkage of models like this might also be available for the salinity management scenarios that we're considering. And so before I wrap up, I just wanted to introduce the discussions. Actually, since we do have time to introduce breakout group discussion questions when we convene in our breakout groups, I think I will skip through the next few slides. So I'm going to just go over these at the start of the breakout group session. And one of the things I wanted to acknowledge before I close today is that through our subcommittee's work, we've begun to identify some needs, wants, and wishes for the long-term collaborative adaptive management process that we felt were not feasible to consider in 2022. And I expect that during the breakout groups, some other topics will come up to put on this wish list. And those are important too. And certainly those topics will emerge out of our October workshop as well. But one idea is that it would be ideal to incorporate voluntary agreements into this scenario planning process at some point in the future. A science question that we felt we couldn't address now, but is within reach for a longer term process, would be, with different strategies for habitat restoration, how often will barriers need to be installed to meet regulatory objectives? As I mentioned earlier, there's a need for new tools to help us model operational decisions that might include TUCPs and other constraints. And then a desirable outcome from the longer term process would be for us to collectively and collaboratively come up with a recommended order of operations to manage risk with progressive implementation as drought conditions evolve. And so finally, if you go to the next slide, just looking ahead after today, what our subcommittee will be doing is revising this proposed pilot exercise based on feedback from today's breakout groups. And then we will seek additional feedback on this revised proposal through 3 focused working groups that will occur through summer of 2022, and requests for written comments on the proposed demonstration exercise. I would encourage you all, in participating in the breakout session this morning, to indicate ways in which you would like to be involved in this follow-up process. There are many ways to get involved, either as reviewers of written material or direct participants in these focused working group summer events. And then the modeling subcommittee will work with modelers that the Delta Stewardship Council will fund to carry out the pilot exercise. I am thinking that it's quite likely that our group will have a lot of topics that we would like to prioritize, or many different iterations of scenarios that we'd like to prioritize in the demonstration exercise. And if we need to narrow those down further to converge on a smaller number that's feasible, it will be quite possible to pre-screen scenarios with lower dimensional models in order to prioritize the higher dimensional model runs, which are, as you might have seen on some of my slides, take quite a long time. And then the results will be presented for further discussion at the October 2022 workshop. And we will leverage those results to kick off this longer term collaborative adaptive management process. So I think I have not left time for questions today, but there will be plenty of time to discuss this in our breakout groups. And I'll also address questions in the chat before the breakout groups begin. Edmund, if you wanted to skip ahead 2 slides, we are now scheduled for a break and are going to return at 10:15 for the breakout groups, which I'll kick off with the questions that I would like this group to consider.
Thanks, Laurel, and see everybody in 10 minutes.
Thank you. So hello again. Just as a reminder, my name is Stephen Elser. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Adaptive Management Unit of the Delta Science Program. I just want to take a few minutes to go over the breakout discussion for today. This is the second of 2 breakout sessions, and in it we'll be focusing in on the pilot scenarios that Dr. Larsen described in her opening presentation today, and we'll be trying to learn from you about how we can improve this pilot scenario process. So this workshop series was designed with the understanding that there's a lot we don't know about salinity management. Although we certainly do have some of the technical expertise necessary to model certain salinity management scenarios, we also recognize that these models fall short. There's a whole lot that these models currently don't tell us, and we want to get feedback and ideas throughout the process to help address gaps in our knowledge to make the scenarios process more holistic. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in the breakout discussion today, we're here to share, listen, and learn from each other. Most broadly, we're hoping to understand different preferences and knowledge of people in the room as it pertains to the pilot scenarios, and have a facilitated discussion to understand general science and modeling needs, as well as address concerns about the scenarios themselves. We're also hoping to learn about other modeling tools at our disposal to improve the pilot scenarios. We want to hear about important trade-offs associated with salinity management strategies that we could potentially model as a part of this process. We want to determine where possible points along this process would be best for us to get feedback. And importantly, we want to identify key stakeholders and interest groups with whom we should be talking to get feedback, and to identify specific areas within the Delta that are of particular interest and concern when it comes to salinity management. Each breakout room will have a facilitator to lead you through the questions via a mural board, and there will also be a note taker to capture a record of the discussion. But breakout sessions will not be recorded. And I just want to go through the questions for the breakout session, since Dr. Larsen didn't have a chance to do so in her presentation. So can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, I guess it did not get updated. So I guess I'll just read through some of the questions. So the first three questions, one will be, of the subcommittee's recommended management scenarios, which would you most like to see modeled and why? The second, are there other off-the-shelf or low-hanging fruit management scenarios that would be feasible to model in about 3 months that you would prefer to be considered? And which climate and/or sea level rise scenarios out of, or potentially in addition to those proposed, would be most useful and relevant to you, your organization, and why? And then the next slide, please. Thank you. What impacts of salinity and hydrodynamics would you like to see us consider in a trade-off analysis? And are you aware of models or modelers that could help quantify these impacts? What is the low-hanging fruit? Which aspects of the pilot exercise should we prioritize for additional stakeholder feedback? Are there particular parts of the Delta that you are especially concerned about under different management and climate scenarios? And which stakeholders or interest groups should we reach out to over the summer to seek additional feedback on the pilot exercise? Thank you. Can we go back to the slides for the breakout session now? Thanks, Edmund. Okay, and I want to be clear that feedback does not end here. There'll be many more opportunities to give feedback on the pilot scenario process in the coming months. As we've alluded to, there'll be focused working groups this summer, as well as some other opportunities in between. So please, if you want to stay involved, contact adaptivemanagement@deltacouncil.ca.gov. And then next slide, please. Okay, and before we go into the breakout sessions, I want to take a moment to just go over the rest of the schedule for today. So in a few minutes, we'll break out into our breakout rooms and have our discussion from 10:30 to noon. From noon to 1, there'll be a break. We'll come back to the main room from 1 to 1:30 and have report outs from our breakout discussions. Following that, from 1:30 to 2:45, there'll be a panel discussion, followed by a 15-minute break before we'll wrap up from 3 to 3:30 p.m. So before we get into the breakout room discussions, I wanted to have a chance for us to address any questions that came up during Dr. Larsen's presentation, since we didn't have a chance to get into them at the end of her plenary. So if you have, so Dr. Larsen, if you're able to unmute or turn your video on, we can try to address some of the questions that you have now or that came up.
You may have to press *6 if you're on the phone.
I'm trying this through my computer right now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
We have a raised hand, Stephen, if you see.
Oh, yes, I see a raised hand from Deirdre. Can you unmute, Redmond? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some assumptions in the calcium model that aren't well documented, but which drive the reservoirs being drawn down to dead pool. And I put some of it in the breakout or in the chat, but I think that the assumptions embedded in the models kind of drove the modeling committee's discussion, and I'm not sure. I mean, I guess we could make recommendations in the breakout sessions.
Yes, I would welcome recommendations that were made in the breakout session. One of the things that I'll note is that the modeling committee did not feel that it would be feasible to relax assumptions that are inherent in the operations model in the 3-month time period. But that is certainly something that we think should be broken open during the longer term collaborative adaptive management process.
Thank you for your question. I see John Herrick has their hand up. Do you unmute them, Edmund?
Yeah, John, your microphone has been unmuted. John, if you're on the phone, can you press *6?
If you're speaking, John, I don't think we can hear you, unfortunately. Could you try typing a question into chat, and maybe we can try to address it that way? Yeah, I see your message in chat that you're unmuted, but we still can't hear you, unfortunately. So there might be some microphone issues. Okay, and I'll just read that question aloud so everyone can hear if they can't see the chat. John asked why no discussion on South Delta salinity. Laurel?
Thanks for the question, John. We're really interested in hearing from the workshop participants that this is an area of interest. Looking at South Delta salinity is certainly within the realm of feasibility for the models that we have available for the demonstration exercise. So that's great feedback.
Thanks for the question, John. Are there any other questions about Dr. Larsen's presentation or about the breakout sessions before we actually enter our breakout rooms?
There was one more in the chat from Andrew Schwartz about the approach used in Delta adapts and how that relates to the approach that we're using here. Laurel, did you want to touch on that briefly?
Oh, I see it. Why wasn't the approach used in Delta adapts different from those presented, considered? You know, I do, one of the things I didn't have a chance to say is that I think there are aspects of the approach being used in Delta adapts that are certainly synergistic with what we're proposing. So Delta adapts is not looking at specific climate projections, but hypothetical future scenarios, which I think is what we are recommending in terms of looking at long-term drought conditions. I talked about some of the nuances associated with the operations model and with using climate projections versus using resequenced data. But one of the discussions that the subcommittee had is that coming up with these hypothetical droughts from resequenced data does seem to be relatively low-hanging fruit. So that's a similar approach to what Delta adapts is using. We do hope to leverage one of their focused working groups that they're holding over the summer to evaluate the scenarios that they're looking at in order to seek additional feedback on the pilot exercise. We are in communication with Delta Adapts. We have members of the Delta Adapts team on the modeling subcommittee. And so we do anticipate coordination and synergies between the two approaches. And I hope that addresses your question. We could chat in more detail later.
You. And then I also did see Darcy suggested that we ask Brett Milligan to explain his comment. So Brett, you made a comment about key assumptions having already been made about scenario planning. Would you like to just speak up to explain a little bit more what you mean so everyone can sort of understand where you're coming from and what you mean?
Sure, I'll try. I think, there's a lot of methods for scenario planning that are out there. A lot of them, and ways you structure a scenario planning process. There's the social side of that, who's chosen to be your people who set it up, and how you decide what the variables are, what your timeframes are, if it's normative, if it's exploratory. I think it would be really helpful, based on some of the things we talked about yesterday, of equity being built into the system, of I think really claiming what has been assumed in this process and what isn't, and what's open for discussion, because I think there is even just choosing to have a hydrodynamically driven scenario process is its own thing. So I just think it might be helpful to caveat some of that and have some of that brought into the questions that are being asked today, rather than saying, hey, here's this scenario that we've set up, how should we run certain questions within it? I think there's also the scenario process itself, which is always up for grabs.
Right, I really appreciate that input, Brett, and I'm completely in agreement with you on all points. Something that was a topic of a lot of discussion with the modeling subcommittee was, how do we do a demonstration exercise in the short amount of time between these two workshops in a way that does include voices that haven't been at the table and can really highlight what we need to do in a longer term collaborative adaptive management process. And we are all on the same page that when we do really open up the box here and look at the full suite of scenarios that could be adapted for managing future resilience, then we do want all stakeholders to be engaged at a really early process. That, as you know, that's a process that takes a lot of time. It takes a huge amount of engagement. In order to have modeling results to show at the October workshop, we felt that it would be helpful for a modeling subcommittee to maybe exert a little more leadership at the outset than we would expect in a full-blown co-production process, really just to identify what we feel is feasible given the committee's knowledge of these models. What I presented as a proposal really is just that. It's a proposal to this group on the models that we might commission to help structure our October workshop and to leverage in seeking engagement from a broader range of partners. It's a proposal, meaning that we're really looking for a lot of feedback. It could be completely restructured before October. But it's a proposal based on our understanding of what is available, what's off the shelf, what's feasible. I definitely agree that there are a lot of assumptions inherent in this approach and in the models that we're suggesting be used. And I think it is really important just to be above board about what those assumptions are. So I appreciate the opportunity to have some additional big group discussion on that topic. And thank you for the question.
Okay, so now we're eating into the breakout time a little bit, so I'm going to ask that we break into our smaller group discussions and continue to have these conversations. Thank you to everyone that's contributed questions and your thoughts so far. That's all been really, really helpful. And we're hoping to, yeah, like I said, continue these conversations into the breakout, and then we'll have another opportunity for larger group discussion after the noon to 1 break, so we can continue this later. So thank you. And Edmund, if you're able to, please break us out into our small groups.
All right, breakout groups are now open. Please join.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a rejuvenating break and are ready for another little bit of conversation. Right now, we're going to do our report out from our breakout session. So we'll have a chance to hear from all 7 of the different groups that had individual conversations about the pilot scenario exercise. So throughout this, if you have questions or add-ons based on what you hear from someone else, you can feel free to put them in the chat. We'll also have an opportunity for you to raise your hand on Zoom after people speak if you want to chime in about something, and you'll be able to unmute at that point. So first up, can we hear from Laurel's group?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can, Laurel.
Great. I'm going to try to go with the computer audio here. I'm still having some internet issues, but let's see. So we ended up having a really great discussion in the breakout group, and we did get to all questions. We started out by discussing the management scenarios that the modeling subcommittee had presented this morning to the group. And what we heard at first was just a lot of pushback on restricting scenarios to just nature-based solutions and traditional engineering solutions, as there were no regulatory solutions or flow action solutions included in the proposal. There was more interest in my breakout group in looking at specific flow actions, such as the State Water Resource Control Board's new flow requirements on the San Jose and those in their first phase of implementation on the Sacramento River. And there was also interest in looking at altered demand management, particularly reduced demand in the future. So a specific question articulated in our group that was of interest might be, how would the new flow requirements, perhaps looking at multiple levels of these flow requirements, impact future salinity? There was also interest in looking at how conveyance, the single tunnel with 3 North Delta intakes, would impact salinity over the future climate scenarios, with a suggestion that the team could draw upon modeling in the draft EIR. Regarding restoration scenarios, we also had a really rich discussion. There was a lot of interest in looking at the impact of different configurations of restoration. And one person in the group made the argument that even when we're thinking about our baseline management scenario, the baseline really should be the planned restoration in eco-restore rather than present conditions within the Delta, because those projects are going forward and it just doesn't make sense not to include them in a baseline. There was also the opinion expressed that there's not much value in looking at restoration, such as the Frank's Tracks Futures project, in isolation, because those results are so sensitive to other restoration that might be planned at the landscape scale. So what our team came around to towards the end of our discussion is that perhaps there's actually a lot of value in looking at what configuration of restoration beyond that planned already would do the most to help control salinity, and possibly running several scenarios looking beyond that eco-restore baseline to see what the impacts of those alternative configurations would be. One of the really useful pieces of feedback that came out of our discussion around the climate scenarios is that it could potentially be more useful to consider a 6-year drought instead of a 5-year drought, since there is a precedent for our state experiencing 6-year drought in recent memory. And Also, local jurisdictions in the Delta have a requirement to consider a 6-year drought in their planning process. So our consideration of that could have benefits for these jurisdictions. And there was also a lot of great discussion on looking at impacts of altered salinity on other processes and outcomes, as well as resources that could be drawn upon in those investigations. And some of the things that came up were non-native clams. There might be models available through the USGS, looking at food web models, leveraging recent work by the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis Working Group that the Delta Science Program recently ran, looking at distributions of invasive species, potentially drawing upon vegetation mapping and modeling done at UC Merced. In terms of economics, I thought a really great suggestion was to look at the extent to which this effort could leverage Delta Protection Commission's economic sustainability plan, which used the in-plan model, which is basically an input-output economic model that uses salinity as a driver. There was also a note that Delta Protection Commission's efforts looked at economic impacts of dual conveyance, and there might be modeling results there to draw upon. There was an expression of support for linking to the Delta agricultural production model. There was interest in looking at salinity outcomes in areas that are experiencing harmful algal blooms. And I guess not just salinity outcomes, but looking at how the outcomes of these management alternatives might impact residence time and temperature as a proxy for harmful algal blooms, specifically in locations like Stockton, where they have been observed recently. There were also interests in trying to get at recreational impacts, including where fish might be, where aquatic weeds are, as well as impacts on subsistence fishing. And I'll mention that again in a moment. But I also flagged several items that emerged from our discussion as items of long-term interest that might not be low-hanging fruit to address in the pilot exercise, but we should certainly keep track of in identifying research gaps and needs for a longer-term collaborative process. And this includes looking at how changes associated with the voluntary agreement process might impact salinity, more explicit modeling of salinity buildup in soils. Existing models really aren't adequate to simulate those processes. A potential need to separate salinity from dissolved solids contributions from agriculture, which might be contributing to harmful algal blooms and other ecological phenomena in the South Delta. And then also a possible need to update about a decade-old study that Fraser Schilling did on subsistence fishing in the Delta in order to better incorporate those impacts. And then finally, in terms of locations of interest, our list includes Cache Slough because of restoration already underway there, the main stem San Jose River around Stockton, the Yolo Bypass, and the South Delta, perhaps with inclusion of a possible breach of Paradise Cut, which is now being considered by DWR. And then in terms of stakeholder groups to reach out to specifically, the list includes subsistence fishers, recreational users, tribal communities, and recognizing that the agricultural community is diverse, and we need to have different regions included in the process because of different concerns, including Central, North, and South Delta water agencies, plus growers themselves, if available. So let me know if I missed anything, if you were in my group, and thanks to my group for a really great discussion.
Thank you, Laurel, for a good report out. Yeah, I'll stop for a moment to see if anyone has any questions. Again, if you have a question or a follow-up comment, you can use the raise hand function and we can get you unmuted. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so I want to move on to the next group since we have so many groups to get through. I'm going to ask Dylan, can you please report out? I think you're reporting out for Ryan's group.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so yeah, we did have a lot of overlap with the items that Laurel reported on, so thanks for covering those, Laurel. I did want to highlight just a few things though that didn't overlap. I think one of the big questions, especially in the context of looking ahead to potential changes in the system, is grounding this conversation in what our objectives are. So an objective to meet current salinity requirements to meet D1641, for example, may be very different than requirements that come up as our climate changes in, you know, multiple decades from now. So a consideration of that would be helpful. And this will also help us think about the trade-offs question. Our group really agreed that that trade-off section was really tricky because while we have the ability with you know, relative strength to model salinity, a lot of the bigger picture perspectives, some of the economic and social considerations are much harder to explicitly integrate into the quantitative models that we have for salinity. And so we discussed quite a bit the importance of stepping back and also making sure that this conversation is grounded in a range of scenarios and impacts that have been considered from that range of perspectives. And just highlighting that some of this may then fall outside of a quantitative modeling framework and require a qualitative look at some of the issues with salinity that would impact the region. One of those issues that came up as well was just the importance of really considering other system changes, potential future levee breaches, restoration projects being implemented that may change the ability to flush fresh water through the system, as well as the potential of the single tunnel construction and operation, both the construction process and the operation process. All of these factors in the future will have impacts on how salinity is managed in the system. And there was a particular perspective expressed just about making sure that the impacts on farmers are adequately considered as projects are being implemented and as planning processes are moving forward. The sea level rise scenarios as they relate to this and other topics were also just mentioned as a key aspect of this. And then we also spent time discussing an approach, what was referred to as a gaming approach to scenarios. So this involves working through a simplified model as a group, where a group has to discuss and sort of decide what actions would be taken at different processes. This is costly and takes a lot of effort, and you need the proper tools, but this was discussed as one additional way that we could potentially improve the robustness of the modeling. And again, with a lot of overlap with the things Laurel mentioned, particularly considerations of the voluntary agreements being sort of a key assessment of some of the objective, defining objectives perspective on this. And yeah, it was a great conversation with the group. So thanks everybody.
Thank you, Dylan. I'll let people have a chance to raise your hands if you have anything else to say. I think that's a really interesting point that your group got into, highlighting the need to look beyond just quantitative modeling results through this process, because there's so much that models can't tell us that are still really important. And so we should be considering a wider suite of tools at our disposal. Okay, I see that Matt Conover has their hand up. Edmund, can you unmute Matt?
Yes, I heard earlier today that the Delta Adapt study was being coordinated and synchronized with this. I read the part 1, in which they concluded, after a great inventory assessment of assets that would be affected, that the low-lying islands in the Delta could be allowed to overtop as sea level rise arose, and that those farmers should then consider salt-tolerant crops. I haven't been able to find anything on the internet about salt-tolerant rice or any other low-lying field crops. There might be some out there. I'm not an ag expert in that, but I wanted to try to get inserted into your process the economic analysis that would look at markets for crops like that. If it's just going to be something as like pickleweed, there's no market for that as far as I know. So other crops should be analyzed if that's the ecological dominant attitude that's going to be taken here toward agriculture. Right now, the saltwater is already creeping up past the legally mandated 3-mile slough limit, and some of our relatives down below Rio Vista are having to pump brackish water onto their vineyards across from 3-mile slough. And then that's below Cache, where they're already doing this restoration effort in eminent domain in response to the tunnel demand for mitigation acreage. DWR is going ahead with that despite objections by the Delta Protection Commission. So those economic impacts on particular farmers should start being added in there with real numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your input, Matt. Thank you for raising your hand and sharing. That was great to hear. Okay, want to keep moving forward since we're now halfway through our time and only through 2 groups. So Morgan, would you be able to report out next?
Sure, thanks, Stephen. Our group actually spent a lot of time talking about the large-scale restoration scenario. Folks are interested in like looking at a landscape mosaic for placement of restoration projects and assessing those that had multi-benefit outcomes. There was some discussion on just challenges with the restoration scenario and that who's dictating land use decisions and who owns pieces of the land throughout the Delta. And that can be sometimes hard to navigate. People shared that like RMA model is a really good place to start in terms of making these complicated decisions, understanding where, what size, where to breach levies for restoration projects, those types of decisions. And then there was just a question in terms of using that restoration scenario and like wondering how far we could like solve or manage salinity with just restoration on its own, and wanting to see that amount articulated. In terms of the climate scenarios, there was interest in this morning, a lot of the options were presented that are more like top-down approach. And so there was interest in more of a bottom-up sort of stress test approach. And Delta Adapts in that process was brought up as an example of that. So folks are wondering why that process wasn't considered. And also just a little bit of hesitancy and the ability for like CalSim to address some of these questions in like the short time frame for this first round. For areas of concern, folks mentioned the South Delta. They also included the Sassoon Marsh as a very unique ecosystem. And for Delta smelt habitat, people included the Trinity River that's often left out of the conversation. People reiterated just the value of including Stockton area as such a home to so many EJ communities that Barbara brought up yesterday. And then really just like the greater Central Valley, Sacramento, San Joaquin Valley, and Southern California. In terms of trade-offs, folks wanted the inclusion of like rainfall distribution and that impact on salinity to be included. Really like hoping that there'll be good translation of model outputs to like the social and economic outputs, and recognizing that it can be hard for like a wide range of stakeholders to weigh in on this type of modeling process when it's hard to follow if they don't have that technical modeling background. And incorporating like EJ community concerns where possible, and recognizing that some of those concerns haven't yet been brought up in these few days, but there are likely more. And then we also, as other groups mentioned, talked about like alteration to the food web, and recognizing that there'll be a lot of change there, not necessarily all bad, but just that there will be a change. And then sort of along the same lines as I mentioned in terms of consideration, like stakeholder groups, really making sure that landowners are engaged, various counties, including like, concerns with changing their tax base. Other EJ groups, the Community Water Center was included as an example, and also not just like adding groups, but just recognizing that different groups require different types of engagement. Sometimes like EJ communities require usually more and longer engagement. And yeah, I think that sums it up for our group. It was a good discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Morgan. I'm gonna, just out of consideration of time, gonna ask for the next few people to try and keep their responses just like under 2 minutes, because we have something that starts at 1:30. So next up, could we hear from Eli's group? I think Eli, you're the one reporting for that.
Yeah, okay. So I can do it in 2 minutes because we're just going to go incrementally. So first of all, in the landscape, the recommended management scenarios, and we kind of expanded that to landscape. We got a good comment that this process hasn't been integrated with flood risk from sea level rise. So as we discuss those two things, we should recognize that some landscape interventions are on purpose and some of them aren't, and that those two processes might be united. There was some interest in restoration and barriers, but people wanted to see, I think in particular, a broader selection of restoration sites, which is something similar to what I heard from another group. On the scenarios, there was a good deal of kind of specific critique on drought and sea level rise projections, some of which might be realizable in 3 months. Some of it might have to evolve in the long term, but they were all good ideas. We heard about the 6-year criterion from the government as well. So I think, the drought, that might be the right drought length. And then one comment that we had is simply that, we don't want to just throw down these scenarios and see what happens. A lot of the interest was, we heard about regulation change, I think, from the first group, but a lot of folks on our group were also interested in changes in carryover, like how do carryover storage rules, maybe as ensconced in CalSim and other, models, how do they change what's a drought? And then kind of almost on the other side of the spectrum, we need to stress the delta in these exercises. No matter what we do, we need to reach a point where agricultural and human beneficial uses get tweaked and that we learn about the physics of the interventions. That could be through a set of fixed parameters, or it could be just by making sure that the drought scenarios do that. But we need to, we need to not just look at upstream stuff and avoid the drought. We need to elicit the bad response. So disaster planning, probably all the way through the lifetime of the drought or disaster, meaning not just does it get salty, does it stay salty, how hard is it, easier or harder to flush out the delta, the whole black swan event. Basically, we need to get in there. I'm
just gonna have to ask you to wrap up, Eli. Sorry to cut you off.
Okay. I think if I can say one other thing, there was a lot of interest in agricultural, learning more from agricultural experts and farmers, and ag economists, and finding out, how does the rate where human use and freshwater corridor use jibe with reductions and changes in agricultural practices, and there's a feedback there that feeds back into how much water is diverted. So it's a complicated question. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you very much, Eli. I appreciate that. Allegra, could you go next?
I think I might be going, actually.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I will do my best to keep this short. We spent a little bit of time kind of talking about the broader program here, trying to think about how the scenario that we're going to do will fit into like a broader approach, and what salinity management could look like more broadly after that. one thing that was of interest to our group that I think I haven't heard anyone else say yet is that there's a lot of interest in South Delta salinity, and we had people who were had particular interest in that. Some folks mentioned floods, which others have talked about, as well as considering modeling some kind of smaller projects that would be, a little bit like little preventative projects throughout the Delta, as well as one kind of thing to think about as those like no regret small projects we could do. We heard a lot of discussion about compounding adverse conditions and how those things can interact. So the flooding is one example. So sea level rise could result in salinity intrusion in and of itself, but it could have the compounding impact with flooding. You could think about similarly drought with groundwater overcharge with worsening basin conditions. And so there was a lot of interest in, as we go through this, to kind of think big picture and long term about how to integrate those things into some of the questions. We heard quite a bit on talking about or weighing through some of the competing objectives as well. And so, I will say another thing that I felt like came out of the discussion too is the importance of visualizing the entire system when we do some of these models, so that people who aren't interested in the very like local conditions can see the broad interconnections throughout the systems when we start to visualize and map it. And I will stop there so that there's time for other people.
Thank you, Corey. Appreciate your brevity there. Could we move to Chris next?
Yeah, so my group talked about similar to Laurel's group. We kind of talked about whether we should be modeling yet or whether we actually need to discuss and define the goals or objectives further first, as well as why we're focusing mostly on restoration when the problem is really insufficient water to manage the salinity. And then we also talked about how there should probably be a discussion about whether the priorities in CalSim, which are consistent with our current regulations and policies, should be modified under the pilot modeling, and whether we could open up those assumptions to the public. And then also updating the time history on CalSim could help those models be better. Next, we talked about the impacts. The most important might be how to not lose control of the Delta. And by that, we meant losing the central freshwater corridor to salinity. Next, we found for stakeholders and interest groups that where the Delta Science Program may be able to make the most impact is bringing in groups from outside the typical power structure. So we basically might have an opportunity to look at how to involve these stakeholders or interest groups at a technical level, where policy questions that may not be favored or answered by the big agencies can actually be modeled. So I think that was the big takeaway from our discussion.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great summary. Okay, we'll move on to our final group. Chelsea, could you give your summary?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And I will also be brief and very selective. So it was a really great wide-ranging discussion. So my apologies for truncating this. But I'm going to focus on the points that we haven't heard and also some of the big takeaways. A little bit different from a couple of the other groups. We actually heard less support for the 5-year drought scenario because some of the model assumptions about water operations don't hold up under 5-year drought conditions. We're going to be operating under emergency conditions. And so that violates some of the basic model assumptions. So there was a lot of support for really the 2-year drought condition, and then also, possibly the 1-year drought condition that would be of particular interest to farmers. Another interesting point to come out was possibly modeling not only drought, but just below normal water years, and also wet and above normal years for understanding conditions related to a specific X2 management action. In terms of trade-offs, I think a key takeaway was that when you pair up models, you're going to increase error. And so maybe another way to approach this is to just model mainly salinity and look at the low salinity zones and use that to understand what other impacts on, wildlife, plants, agriculture, economics, et cetera, might be. That being said, there was interest in understanding impacts on wildlife, especially the lower food web, zooplankton, and the broader food web impacts, as well as impacts on agriculture and economics. Another key takeaway that came out of the whole conversation was the need to differentiate between salinity impacts related to ocean salt intrusion and sea level rise versus salt coming from runoff in the South Delta. I think that we heard a little bit of that earlier, but those might be kind of different processes that need to be addressed separately. I think I'm going to stop with we heard, like I said, lots of great details, but rather than summarizing that, I'll get to one of the big picture points that came. Again, this echoes some of what we've heard, is that these scenarios that are being proposed they come with assumptions that we're going to be operating with the current water operations and water supply deliveries. And that can create an impression of bias toward the current system and beneficiaries of the system. And so a different approach, and forgive me if I'm skewing this, I'm not a modeler, but possibly to model for current and historic desired salinity conditions under different climate change scenarios, and then work to figure out how we can manage the system to achieve those kinds of conditions that are desirable. As far as the pilot exercise goes, there was a recommendation to use this primarily for sensitivity analyses, but then with the outputs, make sure that it's emphatically presented as a pilot, and then provides very specific plan, a problem statement, work plan, benchmarks, and milestone for a longer term process that removes those fundamental assumptions about water operations and water supply deliveries.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, and thank you to everyone else who reported out, and for everyone for participating in the breakout sessions. I'm sorry we couldn't have more time to talk about it as a group, but right now it's time to start the next part of the meeting, which will be a panel that is being led by Tanya. So Tanya, if you could go ahead and take over and get the panel started. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Just want to make sure I have all my panelists here. Just make sure they're all able to unmute and all of that. I see Corey, I see Dan.
Hello.
Hi. I'm looking for Eli, Josue, and Rosemary. Do we have everybody? I see you all. Okay, great. All right, let's get started. So welcome to our last panel of the first workshop on Delta Salinity Management. And I'm Tanya Heikkila. I'm a professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver, and also a member of the Delta Independent Science Board. And it's really an honor to be moderating this terrific panel. Today, we will be discussing some of the needs related to developing a long-term adaptive management framework for salinity management in the Delta. And so some of the topics we'll be talking about in our panel include knowledge gaps and associated research and modeling needs. We'll also be discussing issues related to metrics needed to understand the impacts and trade-offs of different management approaches. We'll talk about some of the governance structures and institutions and processes that might be needed for advancing an adaptive management framework. And then what types of participation from different communities and actors and organizations might be needed to promote more equitable processes and outcomes in this kind of long-term process. So we're going to try to fold a lot of things into this big panel, and we have a lot to cover. So given that, and I want to make sure we get everybody a chance to share their perspectives, we may not have time for each panelist to answer every question. So to keep us on time, I'm going to ask each question to just a couple of the panelists, and then if we have time for follow-up or quick reactions from other panelists, I'll ask them to jump in, but I want to make sure we cover some of the main questions here. And so I have a plan for getting everyone into the rotation and make sure we each have some airtime. And the questions that we'll be asking have been prepared in advance by the workshop planning committee. And so the discussion will largely focus on those questions, but we will monitor the chat. And so if there are key questions that come up in the chat from the audience, we'll try to direct those to the panel as well. And so audience members won't be able to unmute themselves and talk verbally, but please do write your questions in the chat and let us know if you want to follow up with anything that the panelists discuss. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to each of the panelists, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. Please do correct me when I ask each of you to provide a little background. So I'll go through our list of panelists here, and then I'm going to pass the baton to them. So we have Eli Ateljevich, and I probably just butchered that, but he's a senior engineer, supervisor of multidimensional modeling at the Department of Water Resources Delta Modeling Section. We also have Corey Copeland, a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Stewardship Council, Rosemary Hartman, an environmental program manager with the Department of Water Resources, Josue Medellin Azuara, an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Merced, and Dan Olson, a principal and environmental planner and engineer at Compass Resource Management. So with that, I am going to then ask now each of our panelists to just give us a brief background on their professional experience that kind of informs their contributions to this particular conversation. So I'll start. Why don't we start with, I'm just going to go in reverse then. I'll start with Dan and ask you, Dan, to share a little bit about your experience.
Great. Am I off mute there? Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from up in Vancouver, Canada, and we have a small consulting firm called Compass. And the majority of the work that my colleagues and I get involved in is structured decision-making applied to complex resource management challenges. And we're specifically often brought in as a neutral third-party facilitation and analysis role. So we're keenly interested in this process of making decisions, making choices, how groups, small groups, multi-party working groups can balance competing objectives. And we've got a lot of tools and techniques to work through that. My colleagues and I have been involved working in the Delta now for about 5 years. I was a member of the Frank's track team, and I see several of my colleagues involved here today, and currently supporting the Delta Islands Adaptations Project as well, looking at agricultural and other restoration opportunities on Metropolitan's islands. We've been involved in advancing CSAM's Delta Smelt SDM process for several years now, and are currently also involved in the Central Valley Salmonid Recovery Initiative. So all of those various initiatives have various levels of approaches to thinking about adaptive management in the application of science. So I'm happy to share some thoughts today.
Great, thank you, Dan. I am going to ask Josue, please, to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background related to this topic.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I'm a very enthusiastic water resources researcher that has spent the last 15 years of a career working on California water issues, including the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, around the themes of agricultural production, water management, consumptive use, and regional economy. I have also studied some of the effects of salinity on crops in the Delta and of the Delta, the effects of soil salinity accumulation in the western part of the San Joaquin Valley. And I have also served in various Delta initiatives, including the Delta Social Science Task Force that help us identify the opportunities to involve social scientists into the Delta Science Enterprise. And well, I'm a big fan of modeling with water resources modeling and just bring this into actionable items and policy recommendations. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Great, thank you, Josue. Let's move to Rosemary now.
Hi, yes, I'm work at the Department of Water Resources, and I am an aquatic ecologist by training. So I've been doing a lot of work around the monitoring and research on the effects of drought on the ecosystem, and in particular, the effects of our salinity management. So I've been leading the work to monitor the West Falls River Emergency Drought Barrier. And so doing a lot of work analyzing all of the monitoring data that we've been collecting for 50 years to try and answer these questions about how our actions are impacting the ecosystem. It's difficult because there's so drastic shifts between really wet years and really dry years that if you have a really dry year that you then make an action in, trying to figure out, okay, what was the effect of this really dry year versus the effect of decreasing outflow or building a barrier, it can be really hard. No one's happy during droughts, and trying to piece apart the impact of the action from the impact of the drought is tough. And that's one of the challenges with trying to use adaptive management, is not really being able to accurately measure the impact of your actions. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that. And in particular, thinking about the impacts of our salinity management on harmful algal blooms, which relates not only to the ecology, but to the human aspect as well.
Great. Thank you, Rosemary. Let's go to Corey now.
Yeah, hi, I'm Corey Copeland, a senior environmental scientist at the Delta Stewardship Council, as Tanya had said earlier. By training, I'm a geographer, a resource and environmental geographer, which basically means that I am a social scientist who also took all the fluvial geomorphology classes. Since I've been at the Delta Stewardship Council, I've worked on a lot of our larger projects. I was a part of the launch of our View Performance website, which tracks the Delta Plan performance measures. I've worked on Delta DAPS, our climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy, where I've done both modeling and outreach for that. And I'm a part of our social science integration team at the council. And so I would say I spent a lot of time thinking about how to communicate and visualize data and how to reach maybe decision-making points in adaptation, or how data can inform decision-making. And I think, you know, one thing that I'm definitely interested in is thinking about, when we talk about salinity or any other modeling exercises, starting with what's important and then kind of working from there into the decisions about our tools and about our approach altogether in study design.
Great, thank you, Corey. And finally, Eli.
Great, yeah. So my name is Eli. Televich is better than I normally do. In grade school, I had to say a television, a televich. You know, that was, but your way is the right way. I am a modeler by trade. I head up the multidimensional modeling team at DWR's Delta modeling section. I have about 20 years experience modeling the Bay Delta mostly. I have participated in the groups that have done planning or monitoring of both emergency drought barrier installations. I was a steering and advisory committee member for Frank's Track Restoration, which was not only a neat restoration exploration, but also a pretty, I thought, almost groundbreaking stakeholder engagement process that I really liked. I also worked on the sea level rise impacts for the Delta conveyance project, so have a bit of a hand in that as well. Spend most of my time either doing modeling or doing, you know, analysis around modeling, planning scenarios, and that type of thing.
Great, thank you, everybody. As you can all see, we have a really experienced panel here and very knowledgeable about these topics. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time here to engage in all of the questions I have. But like I said, I am going to ask a couple people maybe to respond to each of the questions and try to kind of rotate through the panel. So for the first question, I'm actually going to pitch this question to Rosemary and Eli. And so I might ask Rosemary first. I think even in your introduction, Rosemary, you really got excited about the metrics question. So my first question is, what metrics do you think are needed to understand the impacts and trade-offs of different salinity management tools and strategies?
Yeah, as I said, it's trying to understand the impacts is really difficult. There's the obvious impact of, okay, how's the salt doing? But when the impact of management is so confounded with the impact of the salt itself and the drought, that piecing them apart can be really difficult. And even some of kind of the basic metrics that we use to look at, you know, how the hydrology in the Delta works, like Delta outflow, that should be really simple to do. But there's different ways of calculating delta outflow. There isn't really a great way to measure delta outflow. And if you use different formulas for calculating delta outflow, you'll get different results, especially at those really low flows like we have during droughts when these salinity management things kick in. Trying to improve our modeling and improve our measurements. I always get, I don't come from a modeling background, so kind of the idea, oh, we'll just model it and it'll be fine. It's like, well, should we like actually go out and ground truth that model? Making sure we know what we're doing there. And then thinking about going beyond just the salinity and flow to how is the ecosystem changing, and the socioeconomic system is going to be even stickier, because especially with the ecosystem, dividing the effects of all the other things that are going on during a drought from, say, our change to delta outflow or installation of a barrier is really hard. So yeah, I guess I've just said I don't know and it's hard, which isn't terribly helpful, but being really thoughtful about making comparisons between years where we do and do not have actions, and just recognizing the fact that we're not going to be able to completely piece apart, okay, what was the effect of our action versus salinity versus the drought, I think is really important.
Great. Eli, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, so first of all, it's a moving target. And the reason I say that is that, you know, this workshop really encompasses everything from a mild rethink about the regulatory structure now and how we can better comply or improve the delta in its current form, all the way up to, you know, 3 feet of sea level rise, when the metric is simply, can we still use the delta for its beneficial uses that exist today, agriculture and use as a conveyance facility, really. So to me, I think we have great salinity stations. Like if what you want to do is just watch the advance of salinity intrusion, maybe we don't have the perfect diagnostic things for looking at the why of salinity intrusion, but we certainly can watch its evolution and track our success. But the question becomes for each possible intervention, is it sustainable? You know, as we traverse that evolution from the current state of affairs and trying to make things a little bit better now, you know, what happens when there's 3 feet of sea level rise? Is the restoration area a sustainable and still a good idea, as at least still helping things when that time comes along? So, you know, I think that the better metrics have to be ones that look at that. And then the dual, of course, of salinity is water supply. How does it help the reliability of the water projects and also the reliability of other uses that require low saline conditions like agriculture? So you know, in that case, I think that you're looking for outflow is a great metric, but I think people tend to over grab onto outflow. And one thing I'd like to mention, at least about drought, because it just gets said too little, is that when a drought happens, outflow's not that different than it is during other critical years, when you know the years where we put in emergency barriers, or when we take emergency, you know, they're a little different in terms of outflow than other years, but they're generally pretty, you know, they look very similar. What's different is that the whole through flow of the system, all the spigots get turned down. I mean, you're going to have very low inflow coming in from the Sacramento River. You're going to have very low exports. So, you know, A minus B still equals 3,500 or whatever, but A and B individually are way down. So you have less movement of water through the delta. That affects things that are not just salinity. It affects residence time in the delta, how long things sit there. So those are, you know, the success in a low throughput situation, I think, you know, has to be measured. And you use the same metrics and the same that you use salinity outcomes, but you have to make sure that you're doing it under the right circumstances, and that you're recognizing that you can't create just a scenario based on outflow. It's not enough. You have to assume something, you know, kind of terrible about exports and other things in order to get those. And also, you can't just line up any scenario and hope that you get that outcome. You know, you need to arrange for it to stress the delta if you're going to look at drought actions. So, you know, that's one of the things that I would look for is not, you know, of course, look at the statistics, of course, look at the probability that we're going to end up with certain types of reliability, but also deliberately stress the delta and see what's going to happen under various types of bad scenarios. I think that's my main things.
Right. Let me just ask the other three panelists, so Dan, Corey, or Josue, if anything that you heard from Rosemary or Eli resonated with you, if you want to, you know, tag on to something they said, chime in quickly. Dan, please.
Yeah, I would quickly add that if you're going to set out to develop a set of metrics, they should be directly structured around your management levers, your big management questions. I like what Corey said earlier. Think about what matters first. So all of those socioeconomic, water supply reliability, agricultural productivity in the Delta, all of those things that are tied, and then work backwards from there around the big questions of what you can actually control, and then design your metrics so that you're able to measure those either in scenario modeling or in implementation.
Great. I see Rosemary's hand up, and then Josue.
I just wanted to quickly respond that the things you care about you listed are, you know, water supply reliability, socioeconomic status. You didn't mention the environment, and as the environmental scientist in the group, I need to say also preserving our native fish and wildlife.
Josue, please.
Just quickly, just to tag on, definitely economic costs for agriculture of different management alternatives on salinity. That is something that can be connected, but not only in the Delta, but also outside the Delta. The Delta is a place that is extremely hard to isolate from the whole system, and everything happening in the Delta draining basins, it is mutually impacted. So the other one is water treatment costs for cities. Urban, the utilities that rely on delta diversions might see some oscillations in costs that can become a really important factor in decision making. Also, perhaps carbon sequestration potential. I am not sure, and this is not my area of expertise, but I've been participating in more studies in which this has become a salient issue or a good place to work on our emission reductions. And just along the lines of Rosemary, just see what are the habitat potential opportunities or enhancements or marginal changes in the potential for habitat, essentially how much that changes with the various salinity levels in many locations. And obviously the Delta is a big and complex place, but just having some of those metrics, I think can be of help.
Wonderful. Eli, you have a quick follow-up?
Well, yeah, I was just gonna, it's kind of following up on both Rosemary and Josue. If you don't consider creation of new habitat, then there's really a division, you know, during the season or the year between times when you're operating to something like X2. And when you're operating to those Sassoon or X2 based criteria, it doesn't matter if you have structures in the Delta like barriers, they're a nuisance because you're not going to be utilizing them to protect a freshwater corridor because salinity is pushed far enough west so that other things are key considerations. You might, however, be able to get some habitat out of those situations, or you might, so there may be ecological benefit, there, but it's really not until the salinity encroaches into the Delta and kind of gets right on the doorstep of the freshwater corridor. At that point, I don't think that you typically do have low salinity zone in Sassoon. It's almost like you've switched to a different consideration. So although I spent a lot of time just a second ago advocating a stressful situation that brings the salinity to the doorstep of the Delta, I'm not sure that's where the habitat opportunities are. I think those are, those come more in restoration areas or when you're talking about demand side interventions, things about reoperating the reservoirs or something like that. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to move us along to our next question. And this one I'd like to have Dan and Corey kind of take the lead on answering. So this question focuses really on the institutional arrangements and processes that we might need to advance the implementation of an adaptive management framework for salinity management over the long term. So let's hear your thoughts, Dan, on this, and then I'll pick on Corey.
Yes, so I mean, I love that I'm hearing the word collaborative is built into this overall initiative. And it is also great to know that within the Delta already, there are many initiatives that are being underway in a collaborative manner. So anything within those forums that is bringing competing ideas, information, knowledge holders together through CSAMP and the projects and things that they're sponsoring, et cetera. Anything that is listed that way to bring the people together with different interests and stakes in this management question is super important. Institutionally, this is probably one of the most complicated jurisdictions I've been involved in. I've been involved in large-scale adaptive management programs all throughout Northern Canada and Western Canada and in a few other places. But there is a lot going on here and a lot of competing agencies who have a lot of their own mandates and regulatory requirements that they're trying to adhere to, and they're trying to collaborate across this wider, realm of people who are interested in this difficult question. So any kind of collaborative forum that is brought together institutionally, I think is really the only way forward here.
Great, you're speaking my language, Dan. These are things I look at as well. The Delta is very complex. So Corey, what would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I used to say that the Delta is the most governed estuary in the world. I don't know if that's true or not, but nobody's told me I'm wrong. So figure it must be pretty close to true. But I definitely think when I was thinking about this question, I kind of see two institutional arrangement problems that we have around creating a adaptive framework for dealing with these problems. I think the first is that there's a gap between the people in kind of agency space making decisions and communities that has yet to be resolved, that it's extremely, I think, difficult for people who are affected by some of these decisions to play a role in it. I know a lot of efforts are being made to get rid of some of those barriers, but up to this point, and I mean, even in this very collaborative forum, there's probably almost no space for anyone who's not paid to be here. And so that's a huge issue I think that we may want to resolve. And when we talk about metrics, the metrics that we're hearing aren't really the ones that communities may be interested in or not. And so I do think it would be valuable for us to think about how do we bridge that gap. And then another one relates to what Dan talked about a little bit, which is if we want to have our decisions driven by thresholds or management questions ahead of time, you really need the decision makers to be involved at the very beginning. So you can understand the kind of process. And so I think we sometimes have a gap between the modeling, engineering, scientific community and decision makers. And I think creating forums in which there's more exchange there could also be quite valuable, and in which our marching orders are a little bit clearer so that we can say, this is what I care about, and tailor our models to it. And in the places where that's working are places where, it's all one kind of top-down institution, like, okay, maybe we know that DWR cares about fulfilling its water contracts. And so it's really easy to create those metrics. But when you have a kind of broader community and you're looking across how do we affect regulations that will affect local water users, that will affect water users outside of the basin, and you're trying to get all of these people that are involved in the decisions together, it gets extremely, extremely complicated. And I think creating institutional arrangements that can make all of these decisions kind of upfront about what's important and start designing our studies around them is a great step.
Great, I want to ask the other panelists to respond or reflect on it. I see Rosemary's hand up already. Please jump in.
Yeah, I think one of the issues with salinity management in particular is a lot of the adaptive management situations I've been in the past are like restoration sites where you can take some risks. The idea behind adaptive management is you do all the research and modeling and try and get the stakeholder engagement and try and put forth the best plan you can, but then you have a learning cycle as part of it. And so when you're building a restoration site, you can take some risks and put some experiments to say, okay, we have uncertainty here. What can we do to reduce our uncertainty? If it doesn't work, we can go back and make changes. Whereas salinity management, you know, if you decide to take a risk and do something new, like the Frank's track restoration, if you're wrong, there's a lot more consequences. You know, people will lose their livelihoods. It's not just you'll waste some money on a bad restoration site. So there's a lot more pressure on the institutions to make the right decision the first time, and there might be less willingness to take risks. Also, I think one of the key things that we're learning the hard way is that you need to start developing the modeling tools and setting up the adaptive management framework before you need them, like in a wet year. The emergency drought barrier that we have now implemented twice was on an emergency basis, and we had to jump. I mean, we developed a scientific study to look at the impacts of the barrier on fish predation in like a week. People who did that were just amazing. Whereas if we'd had more time to like plan it out, it might have been a better study. So DWR is starting to look more long-term at setting up drought barriers that can be implemented ahead of time, or not implemented ahead of time, but planned ahead of time so they can be implemented when needed, along with the monitoring and scientific studies surrounding them. But doing that more often, having people thinking about drought during wet periods, I think would really help.
Great. I hear both a lot of thoughts on the need for good processes, but also good institutional capacity and making sure we integrate those two. Josue, please.
Yeah, just real quick. I think one very needed change is more flexibility in the system, just in terms of water allocation, and also in terms of being able to fund some of the needed changes in terms of reductions in diversions and increasing outflows. Just having the streamlined processes to make those things happen more efficiently across the various stakeholders and agencies.
Right, Eli? Oh, you're on mute, Eli.
Great. Yeah, I had my most controversial statement for this whole thing lined up. And this is the moment, I think, which is I just wanted to point out that in a way, the TUCP process has sort of inserted its way into the void of other adaptive decision-making processes. In other words, we had a situation that just structurally, there was nothing below critical. And we hit a situation where we needed something that was, even worse than critical. And the TUCP process, because it's a little bit open-ended, it was the formation of experimental space where we did things that were perhaps, not allowable under the normal D1641 structure, and that became the experimental space. And I'm not saying that's good. I know, folks don't like it, especially don't like the urgent part of the name, because clearly at some level we should be planning for these things in advance. But I can tell you from having been through both of the, all three of the TUCPs in 2014, 2015 and 2021, we didn't know all the answers about how salinity would be transported, about what would happen exactly with there were a lot of unknowns that we did learn, and you could say that we maybe should be folding that into a more formal and structured space, and I would agree with you maybe, but it was an adaptive process, and it did, because you can't stop a mega drought, or you can't stop sea level rise. They will impose cooperation amongst the stakeholders at some point in the process. I mean, it's a freight train. Hopefully you're figuring out how to stop it before it's 100 yards away from you. But it is going to force collaboration at some level. And I think it's just really about us recognizing that maybe we ought to put that into a more flexible and more open process that's got more participants. But I do think that if you look at the experiments with with movement of standards and outflow, you look at the space that the agencies at least were desperate to have in order to make their mistakes, like as Rosemary was saying. So it's a thought. Again, I don't want to be, I'm not overlauding the TUCP process, but I do think it filled a role that wasn't there. So let's create it.
Yeah, great point that crises can drive change and motivate people to work together oftentimes. I just wanted to bring in a comment from the audience. This is a comment from Anka. We did invite her to reflect as kind of an unofficial panelist. And one of the things that she had commented on related to the metrics was that USGS is currently working with the State Water Resources Control Board to improve the precision of X2 estimates, like added stations, testing new measurement devices, and also with DWR installing a new station in the lower San Jose for, quote, doorstep early warning of salinity, going around the bend, past the drought barrier. The bottom line is that we have a really extensive monitoring network in the Delta, but we will likely need more yet to monitor and to understand salinity responses to management actions in a changed climate in the Delta. And you can't manage and model with enough confidence what you don't closely monitor. So just wanted to add that comment in, and I see some hands popping up. Corey, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just kind of weigh in on the thing. I feel like in the Delta, more than anything else, it's one of the most environmentally monitored regions in the country, I believe. And I think the thing that we're behind on is less in gathering data, but in assigning meaning to the data. And so that's really where I think USGS and others and DWR and many others have done a really wonderful job of collecting tons and tons of data. And I would really, where I see us needing to catch up is assigning meaning. And so that means like social meaning, like things I discussed before, like where, at what point are key ecocultural resources being affected? At what point is recreation being affected? At what point are, putting kind of stringing all of these things together? And I think to me that when I think about what is missing in our monitoring framework and our modeling framework, or not missing, that's an unfair characterization, but I think could be improved on is developing our understanding of key thresholds for all of the things that we care about.
Great. Rosemary, please.
Yeah, I was going to say very similar things, actually, is that we collect an awful lot of data, but sometimes, USGS and DWR will be out on the same day, going to the same piling and putting the same instrument on either side of the piling. We've gotten a lot better at that. We don't do that very much anymore, but it has happened in the past. And we're not always great at sharing data or integrating data, even within the Department of Water Resources. We'll have one group collecting data in one way, another group in another way, and it's really hard to use the data to make a complete picture. The Interagency Ecological Program, which is a 9-member agency group that tries to get all the scientists in the Delta together to share data. We've been doing a lot of work to increase the ability for us to integrate our data sets across agencies, make the data publicly available. I'm gonna put the link in the chat where most of the IEP data is available, but it's definitely hard to, we have a long way to go to make sure that the data is available and that it's translated into useful information.
Excellent. Eli, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I got one statement. One nice thing about that new USGS data set is that it is very well positioned, if it were to stay long term, to be a set of monitoring equipment that's very well positioned for watching sea level rise evolve. And when we have a lot of salinity stations out there, but they're just kind of scattered, and the sampling strategy wasn't centered around measuring the processes that get excited by sea level rising. Those are complicated. I mean, we often say it's great to have 3D models in order to be able to capture the right circulations, everything like that. But these circulation models, they have sensitivities such that it's possible to get exactly the same answer for current conditions and tweak and tune your model, and then have almost explosively different answers once you get past about 3 feet of sea level rise. If we had equipment out there, then we're actually, as sea level rise slowly comes upon us, and salinity is going to get quite bad in the Delta as a response, we should be out there monitoring the sub processes that give way to it. Because again, we're relying on the fancier models to be able to reproduce these physics, and they do have the physics in them, but there's enough tuning there, and there's enough that you can't get right just by matching current conditions really well, that I think we should have some monitoring that's actually focused on the process of sea level rise.
Well, you may have anticipated the next question here, Eli. And the next question is really what research or modeling, we could go into the modeling more, could help inform our understanding of the impacts and trade-offs of different management strategies. So I want to start with you, Eli, and then I'm going to ask Josue to also team up and answer that question. So.
Well, I do think that going through the confluence area, especially where that gear is right now, that maintaining that long term would be really beneficial to being able to look at salinity intrusion past the confluence area, which is important. And then, since I've already kind of said that, and I don't think we want to hear too much from me, I want to mention something that I heard in my subgroup a lot in the last breakout session, which is just that there's a lot of interest in the calcium component of this. So when we're starting to talk about reoperating reservoirs, or talking about the characterization of sea level rise within the calcium algorithm, that greater transparency and usability in that little area would have met with a lot of, it would have gotten a good reception in my breakout room. So
great. Josue.
Just to add to that, I think those are excellent points, and I won't talk much about the hydrodynamics because that is very well covered by my colleagues. What I would like to bring crop modeling. We actually don't know much about how the impact in yields can be on crops. There's now we know that there's some crops that are more salt tolerant than others. We know that the landscape changes, and that depending on the salinity conditions, some crops are grown someplace, but we don't understand much the marginal effects of increases or decreases in salinity into crop production economics. The other thing that I think is missing are what are the social aspects of this. We don't know. What are the implications of these oscillations in salinity into the people that lives in the Delta? The Delta not only hosts agriculture, hosts cities and communities that also need our attention, and that is often neglected. So I think those couple of modeling efforts or using various disciplines will be beneficial.
Would any of the other panelists like to respond to that, or have additional thoughts on that question about what types of research or modeling could help us better understand the impacts. And this has been something that's talked about in our breakout groups as well. So yes, Dan.
Yeah, just quickly, and tying this back, I don't know if you'd call this research, but tying it back to our discussion of metrics and such. I appreciated Corey's comment. There's a lot of data available. Synthesizing that into meaningful metrics that are tied to those ecosystem values and things that you're trying to measure. So if you start with the management actions you're trying to consider, link to all the values you're trying to work towards, the objectives, come up with your metrics, and then you could do that kind of work. But you will, in my estimation, inevitably come up with some objectives that you don't have good information for, perhaps some of the ecocultural values, et cetera. But in those cases, I just want to put a plug in there for structured expert elicitations. There are knowledge holders out there that if you don't have data sets, you can work with them to develop metrics and learn as you go, just as you would with any other scientific data set that has uncertainty built into it.
Great, thank you for adding there, Dan. Those were important points. And I think some of this ties into our next couple of questions. And I'm actually going to start now with Josue and Dan and answering this next question, which is around knowledge gaps. So in what areas do you think there are significant knowledge gaps that, if addressed, could be incorporated into decision support tools to address trade-offs more comprehensively across scenarios? So let's see, Josue, do you want to start with that one? You were hinting at some of these, I think, before, but feel free to expand.
No, I think it's pretty closely related to the previous question. I think consumptive use has been studied a lot for crops, and it is more or less well understood. We have now open access approaches such as OpenET to explore the range of consumptive use in crops in the Delta that has an influence in the parameters of hydrodynamic and other in management. But there are aspects of the water balance that are less understood, and that is effects on irrigation. What are the irrigation methods, and also the effects from aquatic vegetation and open water channels on this water balance. So that could also could shed some light on these knowledge gaps. Also, between the link between irrigation irrigation type and diverted water, as I was mentioned earlier, and cost of benefit of management aquatic vegetation can be enlightened by estimating how much is the consumptive use on those, and hopefully help in allocating funds in aquatic vegetation controls. Thank you.
Wonderful. Dan, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think the only thing I could add, I'm not close enough to the scientific data gathering or socioeconomic, for that matter, to know what the actual gaps might be. But when I see the heroic efforts of everyone pulling together information, I'm always amazed at what people can pull together with the information that's available. One thing that I would call it a gap is that once all of this information is assembled, and I can envision this project months from now having these different scenarios that are modeled and these results that are output to be put in front of decision makers for consideration. I think it's a gap in how we explain uncertainty to decision makers, because outside the outputs of any predictive model, there are error bars. And it is our decision makers who are the ones who have to apply their risk tolerance to whether they're making a risky decision or not, to pursue one course of management action or not. And I think as a collective community, we have an obligation to better describe the uncertainty in the model predictions that we're using as the basis of decisions.
Great point. Anyone from the rest of the panel chime in? Rosemary, please.
Yeah, I think there's we've been talking a lot about the trade-offs and uncertainties with, consumptive use and the water balance versus salinity, how we're measuring salinity and outflow, very important kind of baseline work. But my background, the ecosystem, there's a lot of ancillary problems that come up with some of our salinity management issues that we don't have we have an even worse handle on things like harmful algal blooms, which is where I've been spending most of my time over the past year. Putting in these emergency barriers will reduce residence time in certain areas. And we don't really know the extent we don't know enough about the parameters that cause harmful algal blooms in the Delta right now to know which of these management scenarios will exacerbate the problem and which will actually help to alleviate the problem. I mean, having salinity intrude in the Delta will probably decrease our problem with aquatic invasive weeds and harmful algal blooms, obviously increase our problem with salinity and water supply. But, taking actions that will keep the salinity down, understanding what conditions will cause an increase in harmful algal blooms is something where we really don't have a very good handle yet. So better models of what that looks like, and more regular monitoring of cyanotoxins in particular to know what the effect, how prevalent they are in years when we're not taking any actions is really important. That's something that DWR and Reclamation are working hard to implement over the next year.
Thank you for those additions, Rosemary. Corey, please.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I also wanted to just speak to one piece of the co-equal goals is Delta as place, and I think that my agency is given the mandate to enhance the cultural, recreational, natural resource, and agricultural values of the Delta, and I think that we're extraordinarily far behind in our ability to categorize some of those, especially cultural and recreational values. And so when I think about significant knowledge gaps that we may need to address, I see that as a major one. And we are undertaking efforts to enhance social science investment in the region, but we're pretty far behind, and I hope to see more of that because I think it's a key gap.
Yeah, sounds like we have several key gaps and a lot more to discuss as we move forward with these next workshops. So I have one final question, and I want to save some time to address some of the audience comments as well. And I'm getting some real-time summaries of some of those comments. I haven't been paying as close of attention to the chat as maybe some of you, but let's go through this last question, and then we'll try to get to a few of these comments from the audience. It sounds like there's some great ideas popping up there as well. So the last question we have is, who needs to be involved? So who should be kind of part of identifying future salinity management strategies? And I think we touched on this in one of the earlier questions, but then also think about what are some of the barriers to the involvement of the diverse interests and actors and communities that would need to be involved. And so I'm going to start with Corey on this question, and then ask Rosemary to chime in, and then anybody else can, of course, chime in as well. So Corey, you're up first.
Yeah, I think, we hear about a lot of barriers from communities when we talk to them. If you're trying to get, community organizations involved, for example, there's capacity and funding barriers. People have a whole lot of things to stretching their attention. And so, for us, the salinity management is extremely important, but for some of these groups, it's just one of a huge number of things that they're trying to advocate for their community for. And so, we've made efforts and found that trying to support people, ideally, if you can pay people for expertise on their communities in the same way you might any other consultant, that's kind of a very ideal outcome. But there are other barriers as well. There's hesitancy around people from agency side sometimes can see community groups as adversarial or litigious or something and not want to engage them. You can have barriers around the timing of events. So if it's only during the day in a weekday, community members aren't going to be able to attend. And then there's just broadly barriers of understanding. I think it would be hard for a complete layperson to enter an event like this and have an easy understanding of what all of the modeling means and the way we talk about it. And then, on the other side, if we were to go to some of their community meetings, we might be quite surprised about how they're talking about these problems as well. And so I see these large barriers, and I think that there are opportunities we need to create to enhance understanding. I guess I'll take one last second to plug an event called Science for Communities that the Stewardship Council is organizing that will occur in the fall. And, we're looking to create a venue to kind of hopefully bridge some of these gaps a little bit, or at least create opportunities to. I'll let someone else talk now.
That's great, Corey. Is there information on that? Can you say the name of that effort?
Yeah.
Again?
It's called Science for Communities, and I will put a web page on it. Okay. I'll share that in the chat.
All right, Rosemary, anything to add on that?
Not really. Definitely 100% agree that we need better community outreach and engagement. And that's someplace where I'll admit I don't have a lot of expertise, but I've been trying to, where we can, work with our community partners. And I definitely feel on the education side of things that Corey said, figuring out how to make sure community members and stakeholders have the information, have time to get the information, resources and funding for not just attending the meeting, but doing the background research so that they're prepared for the meeting. I think can be a big obstacle, and making sure that even starting in school kids' education on just the water system in California is something that I think is really important and has been under-recognized.
Josue, I see your hand up. Please chime in.
Yes, I should say that we can, to your question, find many barriers for sure, but I think participatory planning and policies of processes that bring the value of diversity and inclusive views can certainly outweigh the cost of inaction due to conflicting objectives and views. So it's worth the risk. Either you talk to the stakeholders early in the process, or you talk later, hopefully not in court. So that's it. At the minimum, states should involve the water agencies, both agricultural and urban, and in groups, environmental groups, that conservation groups that look into habitat opportunities, and but also involve somehow the delta draining basins that are not completely disconnected on many of the decisions that happen for management in the delta. So I think it's good to be inclusive with all these views.
Excellent points. Dan, I see your hand up too.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in before Eli here. We might be saying the same thing. It sounds easy, like who should be involved, and of course anybody affected by the decision should be involved. Now that sounds very easy to say as a starting point, but all that said, there are some good examples. I think we worked really hard, as you know, Eli, on the Frank's Track project, and Brett Milligan and his team at UC Davis designed a whole co-design methodology that we were happy to be engaged with. And frankly, the alternatives that were considered in that project were hugely strengthened by getting the people in the room who lived there and were directly affected by the changes that were being considered. How hard that was for Eli to go and model afterwards is a different thing, but you can't replace that local firsthand knowledge in things. And we're trying to replicate some of that same methodology on the Delta Islands Adaptation Project, with coupling both your technical planning team and all the work that has to be done, and coupling that with broader outreach techniques. And we all know those are available out there. Yeah, so I'll just stop there.
Great. Eli, I see your hand up. You want to have the last word here on this question?
Largely echoing what Dan said, I think a lot of what sometimes some stakeholders don't have is access to modeling, or they really do need to have their ideas percolate into something that's considered and modeled. And sometimes there's there's a barrier to entry because of difficulty or just a kind of a constrained scope or something. So it's nice if there are these processes like the Frank's Track Futures processes that, I don't know, kind of lends an official wrapper or a mandate around including some of the scenarios that stakeholders want in the actual modeling process and allow them to hunch over the table. I happen to notice in the, Frank's Track was right on the cusp of COVID. And I have to tell you, that process was not as rich, just the very, very tail end of it was a little bit of a notch down. I mean, there's something about being hunched over the table that really helps. I don't say that about it. I'm a teleworker at heart. I think there's a lot of things you can do remotely. I'm not sure that this process is necessarily one of them. And the other thing is, one of the roles I felt like, that I helped play in Frank's Track, but it helps if it's in there in some form or another, is taking ideas and translating them into something that is modelable, because sometimes, sometimes it's not modelable, but sometimes it is, and it just needs, like a rephrasing, or it needs to be embodied in some boundary condition assumptions or something, something in model speak, and then it becomes a tenable option to model. But I work for DWR. If there's no official framework for me to work on to do that, I might not have the mandate to do that. But sometimes if there's if that's created officially, then it's something that we can work on as a community. So, and it's super fun when it comes together. Like, I can't say enough. Dan is absolutely right that that design was better than the sum of its parts by a long shot. So it's really worth having, it's worth doing.
Yeah. What I hear you all saying is that the community engagement and participation in the kind of co-design of scenarios and modeling needs to be thoughtfully planned, needs to be institutionalized, needs to be formalized, but in a way that's kind of co-produced almost. Yeah, it's not just going to happen because we think it's a great idea. So we really have to invest the resources and the time and the capacity into it. I want to move on to some questions from the chat, and Chelsea's been helping me by summarizing a few points here and sending me things, so I don't have to scroll through the whole chat. But maybe if I miss something, folks on the panel are welcome to jump in. But since we just had the Frank's Track discussion, one of the earlier comments was a question really around how restoration projects can put risk on neighboring landowners and water users. And they're often not set up to adapt if those impacts are very negative. So I'm wondering if maybe Dan, your experience with Frank's Track, do you have any thoughts on this, on how to respond, to think about these kind of impacts, especially if we're seeing them unfold? We may not observe them in the planning stage. It may be something over time that we see in the implementation. How do we think about that in the long term?
Yeah, just top of mind, I would say, if people adjacent to your planning area are affected by what you're doing, that's just another reason to engage them. We certainly did hear examples of that on Frank's Track, with concerns of people who were perhaps making assumptions of what the impacts and the adjacent impacts might be. And those have to be legitimately researched, explored, and addressed in the planning process. I know there were several times where we did some documentation just because of some of the concerns that were being raised in public forum and that kind of thing. And just to that point, I just want to, I forget, it might have been Corey talking earlier on a related note about kind of the inequality of some people trying to engage in these planning processes when it's during their work hours and the rest of us are getting paid to do this work. there's a huge onus on the planning teams involved with designing these kind of projects and engagement processes to assemble the information packages and anticipate the questions that are going to be coming, and to have those forum where you're gathering those questions early and preparing for the answers. We put an enormous amount of effort into assembling information packages to make the engagement as easy as possible and available on the website and all of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Great. Yes, Rosemary, please.
Yeah, I think the other thing that always comes to mind when we're talking about the Frank's Track Future process, which was a great groundbreaking example of stakeholder engagement in a restoration site. We had this really cool collaborative process that did a lot of modeling, had some great design alternatives, and that's where it's sitting. It is not, there's no funding for actually implementing it set aside yet. There's no further planning process. And so I think what we need to do is figure out how to tie these collaborative planning processes to the urgency, regulatory mandates, we must do this, that most of our major projects get implemented under. That's where I think the real problem is, and what I was saying earlier about not being willing to take risks. And yeah, in terms of restoration sites not being set up to adapt if they have negative impacts on their neighbors, it'd be great to find out what examples the person is thinking of, but that is definitely a problem with even adaptive management on restoration sites, which is a little more, in theory, is lower risk and a little more palatable than adaptively managing salinity in the estuary. Actually having the funding and institutional support to continue to monitor your site after it's built and the impacts on neighbors. And then if you made a mistake, actually going back in and making changes, that's been a sticking point in adaptive management for a long time, is that you have an adaptive management plan. Sometimes you monitor for a little while, but you don't actually follow the cycle and synthesize the data, as Corey was saying earlier, decide whether you need to make changes and then implement those changes.
Yeah, you touched on, I think, a couple of comments that came up in the chat. Chelsea mentioned to me that a couple of these comments focused on kind of the regulatory constraints and constructs that often aren't set up to accommodate adaptive management planning. So even when there's a willingness to move forward, there's often the regulatory constraints that hinder us. And so I guess, would anyone else like to kind of speak to how do we manage or improve these regulatory dimensions to allow more effective adaptive management, at least in the case of salinity management, if we want to focus on that? It's a tough question, but any of you have thoughts on that? Dan?
Yeah, not to stray too far, but I was very interested to see through my involvement in the Delta Smelt project that the 2019 BIOP and the ITP had actively built in adaptive management programs for the implementation. I thought that was a real step forward to explicitly call it out and say, here's the actions that we intend to implement, and we intend to implement them within an adaptive management framework. Now, the extent to which that's effective, et cetera, I'm not close enough to it to know. But as a step in tying it to the regulatory process, there are jurisdictions, and my colleagues are involved in the Missouri River, that have very explicitly tied their adaptive management programs to the implementation of their RPAs under their BIOPs. And it is a very formalized structure that's been in place for many years now. So there is precedent out there for tying adaptive management to the regulatory regime. And I think there's more opportunity, I would say.
And I'll just, to tag on that, I am part of the adaptive management in the 2019 BIOPS in the summer fall habitat action for Delta smelt. And it's been an interesting process, we'll say that. But adaptive management in that situation where we are using an adaptive management structured decision-making framework for what's going to happen this coming year, and next year we'll reevaluate and might do different actions the next year. That is where I think adaptive management is easier to implement, because we have 1 year, we see the results, we make changes. When it's a large restoration project where you might not see the full results for 10 years, and you'll probably have to apply for new permits if you want to make any changes. That's where it gets harder to set it up ahead of time to really be nimble.
Corey, please add on.
I also just feel like a lot of these adaptive management frameworks occur within a mitigation context where kind of if you think about the political goal of mitigation, it's largely to accomplish something else, and the mitigation is secondary to the objective of whatever your action is. And so it's usually meant to be done as cheaply as possible within whatever. And in some cases, you legally might not be able to spend money on things outside of mitigation, in fact. And so a lot of times what happens with these projects is that you can't spend money on recreational activities. You can't do enhancements that might otherwise benefit some projects. And it's just, sometimes you have people whose hands are tied and would like to be doing better, but it's a framework and a goal that doesn't accommodate it as well as we'd like. And I think adaptive management is often, secondary, because once you have the credits, the idea of constantly funding and improving these projects later, maybe the money just won't be there in the way it is to design it and get them implemented in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Eli, would you like to chime in? Oh, you're still on mute. Eli, oh, there you go.
So yeah, so I think that maybe one of the things that would be good for this project to do would be to triage the actions into things that are reasonably adaptive, like reservoir carryover rules are adaptive, but 10 million pounds of fill are maybe not, or you could design Frank's restoration to at least allow for some sort of design adaptation. I mean, if you can anticipate a few of the things that might go wrong with it. I mean, one example that I can think about that though is there were some channels that cross over from the west to the east side of Frank's tract. And I often thought, those might erode more quickly than we thought they would because they've only got peat underneath them. Maybe they could be built with some sort of armoring or something like that that would allow, you could adjust the configuration of that a little bit, or maybe I don't know, there are ways that you could configure it to being amenable to either going farther forward with solutions or to fix the one that you've got that is now broken. But for lack of that it really is millions of pounds of fill that's just going to be there, and you can't walk it back that much. So maybe it should just be, we should recognize that some things aren't adaptive and just nod our head to that.
Well, great. We are getting close to the end of our time here together, and unfortunately we didn't get a chance to go through all of the comments that were put into the chat. There's some really good ideas in there, so I encourage everyone to scroll through those if you get a chance. But I'd just like to give each of you 1 minute or 30 seconds, let's say, to offer any closing thoughts or something that you really wanted to say and haven't had a chance to comment on, just around this theme of how do we develop a framework for adaptive management of salinity in the Delta, and how do we think about some of these trade-offs that are really tricky to measure and assess, and you know, how do we move forward on this for kind of a long-term plan? So any final thoughts? Let's start with, let's go with Josue, and then I'll just loop around the room here.
Thank you. I think we should not isolate the deltas as a place. We should also think in what gets to the delta and out of the delta. There's mutually, interacting relationships there between these places, and we should just take into account those for managing salinity.
All right, Dan?
Yeah, I guess as a final comment, and I would say I've only been able to pop in and out of the workshop the last 2 days, so I'm catching a flavor of what this initiative is all about, and it's super interesting to me that something outside of the regulatory regime can freewheel a little bit to move forward. Having seen some of these big programs try to get off the ground elsewhere, I would say, you know, again, I think I said this earlier, tying it to your management actions that you want to consider, developing really strong conceptual models right off the bat, and then coming up with those key management questions and break them down analytically into questions you are trying to answer with management relevant metrics and management relevant information gathering, tying it all back to that will go a long way to structuring the program.
Great. Eli?
Remember it this time. Yeah, I would just say that if we're going to try and create an adaptive plan, that we should try as much as possible to be mindful of the individual scope of this is an awfully broad project just because it seems to encompass both all of sea level rise going forth for 50 years at the same time that it maybe does a better job of managing the delta right now. And I realize that everything in the world is all tied together and that you don't want to do an intervention if it's going to be lousy in 50 years because of sea level rise. So in some ways you do have to anticipate the end game a little bit, but I think that we need to have smaller cycles of an adaptation around some of the more modest goals, get the things that can really be done now done. And then of course, we're going to be adapting to sea level rise, no matter what we do. I mean, of course, in 15 years, we're going to know more than we know now. And in 40 years, we're going to know more than we did then. So, in a sense, it's kind of obvious that we're going to be having some sort of an adaptive management around sea level rise. The key now, I think, is just to anticipate enough of it to make the decisions that are in a 20-year framework still be pertinent, or at least, I think we have a better chance of success in the 20-year decisions right now. If we're just mindful of the 40-year decisions, just enough, to not step in it too much when it comes to when the next 40 years is revealed. And it's just a thought that the scope of this seems awfully broad. I think that's my last word. Yeah.
Corey, any quick thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, this is going to be maybe fairly similar to what Dan said, but I do think that really focusing on what's important ahead of time. I even think thinking about this as a modeling exercise is kind of a mistake. The model is just the tool that you use, and that you got to start with the question of what's important and have an approach that allows you to talk about what's important and then apply the model as a tool afterwards, if that's the appropriate way to address it. And so that's, I guess, what I would encourage us is just to always constantly be focusing on that end goal.
Wonderful. Rosemary, last word.
Well, I guess if I only have one last word, it's that please consider endangered species and environmental goals along with the human uses in the Delta as you're developing a adaptive management framework. And if I get a second last word, we're going to need new tools. What we have now, what we're talking about in this workshop, flows and restoration and barriers, might work for the next 20 years, but 50, 70-year horizons, we're going to need new ideas if we want to keep the Delta.
Great. Well, thank you for keeping that long-term perspective in mind, and thank you all for your time and your energy and your insights here. It was really enlightening and informative. So we will close off our panel and turn it over to our workshop organizers again. Thank you all.
Thanks all. Thanks, Tanya, for excellent moderation. We're gonna go to a short break now. You have about 12 minutes and we will reconvene at 3 o'clock for a brief summary and report on how to stay engaged with this process going forward. So see you all in a few minutes. It's 3 o'clock, welcome back from break. Edmund, are you ready with our closing slides? If you stuck it out this long, congratulations. The last of the cookies and coffee in the back of the room are all yours. I just wanted to go ahead and change the slide, Edmund. I just wanted to spend a few minutes briefly closing out these couple of days and letting you know what to expect from this process moving forward. So as a bit of a recap of what we've been doing so far, we've had 2 days of panel discussions and breakout group discussions. And so you might have gotten the sense that a lot of what we're trying to do here is gather information from you, the participants in this workshop. Our planning committee started meeting about 8 months ago to work on putting together what we could figure out about the topic of salinity management and how we wanted to approach getting broader engagement. And what we originally envisioned was we were planning a workshop on the topic. And as we met more and we started to piece together all of the things that we didn't know or wished that we understood better or voices that we wanted to hear, we realized we can't just have a single workshop and say, here's the state of the science on salinity management. You're welcome, everybody go home. So what we've invited instead is a process where we're really deliberately trying to gather lots of information from you, from the community, from our agency partners, from our broader Delta community and affected parties. And so thanks again to all of you who have participated in some way in this first couple of days. This is the beginning of us building. So I'm going to go through a few of the things that we've learned and really just touch on it briefly because we've already done some summarization. You've heard breakout group reports from the different groups and things. So I don't want to belabor over and over again the same points, but I want you to understand that we came here to listen and to try and get your messages incorporated into the planning for our future process. So next slide, I'm just going to go through a few of the things that we've heard loud and clear here in the past couple of days and that I think we'll be considering a lot as we think about what we're doing this summer and then in the fall. Thanks, Deirdre. Deirdre has some cookies for everybody. So one of the points is the current regulatory system has many shortcomings and conflicts. Many shortcomings with regards to broad issues. There's maybe an interest in reevaluating some of what the current regulatory system entails. There are baked in layers of inequity within the current regulatory system, and we've heard about that over both of the days, that the way that the system is designed is for a current set of beneficiaries, and that may require some reevaluation as well if we're digging into what are the impacts of salinity management, is best understanding how those impacts are distributed. And then there are conflicts among environmental standards that occur with limited water supply, such as protecting salmonids versus estuarine fishes, water quality for different constituents. Process improvements. There are several process improvements that we heard needed in this first day of discussion. A big one is just a mechanism for more effective dialogue that includes more voices. And we're hoping that in some way, this can be a piece of that. but we're also looking for suggestions on how to build that more. And creating a safe space for exploring some of the salinity management trade-offs. And finally, just appreciating yesterday, especially that the socioeconomic trade-offs represent a big knowledge gap, and we currently lack adequate tools for evaluation. Next slide, please. In our breakout groups, if you were participating yesterday, you were posed this question in a Mentimeter exercise, this open-ended question where we were accepting multiple responses. In what ways do you see salinity management as beneficial or harmful? This is a really important question for our team to get more information on, because in order to understand what things we want to measure, to track progress towards objectives, we need to understand how it affects different parties, organizations, and individuals in beneficial and harmful ways. So we captured a lot of ideas in the breakout discussion, and we've compiled these into a mural that you can interact with. So one of my staff will put that in the chat. Thank you, Chelsea. Saw the link just go in. You can log in and you can zoom in and out, and you can see all of the different anonymous responses that folks contributed in that breakout session yesterday. We've also left some sticky notes at the bottom. And so if you didn't get to participate yesterday, or you have new ideas now, you're welcome to add those as sticky notes. So this is, like I was saying, one of the ways that we will continue to be informed on how to parameterize this, and also how to engage and with whom to engage. Next slide. So today our breakouts were really focused on the pilot scenario exercise, and we got some actionable feedback on those scenarios to shape the pilot exercise. Some really important questions were raised in these breakouts, important questions and qualifiers, honestly, whether we're even ready to start modeling, emphasis that there's a need for this modeling exercise to be treated as a pilot exercise and clearly presented as a pilot exercise and not as the foundation for policy decisions. And I think we realized those limitations going in, but it's helpful to hear that reflected back to us from the groups. Multiple groups commented on the timescales. There was some convergence on a 6-year drought scenario to align with other planning processes and laws. One group brought up the important point that the eco-restore plan restoration could be treated as part of the baseline condition, so that we can appropriately synthesize other actions alongside those future landscape changes. Several groups supported multi-benefit scenarios and asked that we integrate other climate change risks, such as flooding. Some groups wanted to see even more nature-based solutions represented and analysis of restoration. Other groups pushed for more regulatory solutions and flow actions to be investigated. So we'll be digging into the details of those breakout notes while we think about how to adapt our approach in response to your input. We also gathered input on metrics. We added several new ideas to our list of potential metrics and heard reinforcement of some of the ideas that Dr. Larsen and the planning committee had already identified. I won't list all of the individual things since we just heard breakout report groups a couple of hours ago, but we heard about a range of ecological and social and economic metrics, and that's, like I said, again, very helpful for us in identifying who we need to talk to over the next few months and what metrics we might be able to consider with existing tools, and what metrics we might want to consider even if we don't have existing tools to consider them. We also brainstormed some ideas of who to engage with going forward beyond the people that are present here, and I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because we're really trying to have broad participation in our summer months. As you'll hear from my colleague, Dr. Elser, in a minute, our summer months are really designed to try and engage even more of our community members in the conversation. And so it's very helpful for us to get those ideas from you about who to engage with. Next slide. I'm gonna, let's see. Yes, okay. So I just wanted to give a few of the highlights from today's panel. and maybe don't need to belabor this since you were all just there, but these are a few of the high level points that I summarized from that I think are really of great import to our future process. Recognition that measuring salt is easy, measuring impacts of salt is the hard part. I think, we know that, but it's important to recognize just what the nature is of our existing models versus the information that we want to be getting from modeling. There are metrics that matter to the community, and those must be collected in processes that are specifically designed for community engagement. Where data is missing, we got some suggestions about ways to do structured solicitations to gather knowledge, and a recognition that some things can be done remotely, but perhaps this is not one of them. And so as we think about how to proceed with this process going forward, how do we integrate hybrid or in-person interactions as an option for community engagement? Adaptive management is challenging, and our panel talked about a lot of the different challenges. We're, as a broader we the Delta community, we're reluctant to take risks at this large scale of adaptive management, in part because it interacts with people's livelihoods, and some of these actions are very long-term and potentially irreversible. But we did identify in the conversation some actions that lend themselves more to an adaptive management approach. Rosie described some of the flow actions that can be modified on an annual basis, and contrasted that to longer term actions such as landscape changes. So some things are more amenable to adaptive management approaches than others. And then there's lots of data. I think we all know this about our system. There's lots of data, but there's a great need for synthesis and modeling. The modeling that we do now is imperfect, and we're going to need some new scientific tools in order to really address the objectives. Next slide, please. I'm going to toss this to my colleague, Stephen Elser, to talk through what we're going to do in the next few months. Stephen, take it away.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Karen. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to take another moment to show our timeline for the pilot scenarios exercise, which we've talked a lot about today. So in June and July, we're planning to have 3 separate focused working group sessions split into roughly 2-hour chunks. We're planning that one of these sessions will overlap with Delta Adapts, which is the Delta Stewardship Council's climate vulnerability and climate adaptation strategy. So we're hoping for some synergy there. In these focused working groups, we'll be diving into the details of developing the pilot scenarios and continue to foster a conversation about the impacts and trade-offs associated with different salinity management decisions, building off of the conversations that we've had yesterday and today. Ultimately, the summer sessions are intended to help us generate pilot scenarios that will then be evaluated with computer models, which will lead into the October follow-up workshop. In October, we'll have that workshop to actually compare the modeling outputs from pilot scenarios. And through these comparisons, the trade-offs associated with different salinity management strategies should hopefully become apparent. And we'll then refine ideas about our future research and scenario-based modeling needs to make the scenarios more useful and interesting to a wider range of people. And we'll identify partners and start to plan for how to create a collaborative adaptive management framework for the longer term. I want to emphasize that the work won't stop in October with regard to this scenarios process and to salinity management in general. We hope that this is just the beginning of a longer, more collaborative and co-productive process for envisioning a positive future for the Delta as it relates to salinity management. So there will be more opportunities for, there'll be more opportunities for engagement. So really encourage you to stay involved. Next slide, please, and I'll hand it back to Karen.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so I hope that we've said it 10 or 15 times now in these last 15 minutes, but this process depends on your engagement and your ideas. if you have thoughts to share or suggestions for other communities or organizations that we could be reaching out to, please contact us using this email address, adaptivemanagement@deltacouncil.ca.gov. And by the fact that you've registered for this workshop, you will continue to receive information unless you decline and tell me you want to unsubscribe, but otherwise you'll continue to receive information about our ongoing process. And I do encourage you to share this with colleagues and community members that you think might be interested in continuing to provide input on the pilot scenario exercise or the metrics that we should be looking at. And that's it. That's our day. So as a way of closing out, I just want to thank everybody that takes an army to pull one of these things off. So Stephen Elser, Laurel Larsen, Chelsea Batavia, Edmund Yu, Brandon Chapin, Beck Barger. We've all been collaborating behind the scenes. Louise Conrad, sorry, we've all been collaborating behind the scenes, not to mention our excellent panel moderators, Tanya Heikola, Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, and Michael George. And of course, our larger planning committee and modeling subcommittee. So thank you all for those of you who've done heavy lifting to make this possible. And thank you all who participated over the last couple of days. We'll see you this summer. Have a good one.